screens, it's a plot to drop the IQ. Fighting amongst each other over rumors that don't like you. Prefer us trapped in melancholy with the wood wands of holly. Suggestions that obliterate to camouflage the folly. Attempted mental robbery, executed sloppily. The paupers see this mockery and walk the talk with me. Put the hands up to touch the Akasha, cause you know deep down there's something bigger than your wallet.
Sweet eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful, friends. My guest tonight goes by the moniker of the Great Baldini and was only just with us a few episodes back, but we wanted more. The Great Baldini and I last talked of what in our society produces the slavish sheep mentalities that seem so prevalent, and what it is that might break someone free from that ever-present programming. We wandered through the many trenches of warfare that exist in the everyday battles to stay free, true, and intentional within this mire of moat around the castle of control, and perhaps even to call others to wander toward the mountains and leave these trappings behind. Today, we hope to further those discussions and talk more intricately of programming through language, determinism, and pattern recognition. But first, before we get started tonight, let me remind everyone that you can find my memoir, my fictional novel, my poetry, my articles, my photography, and even an offering of tarot readings and life guidance on my site at www.rogueways.org. You're also welcome to come check out the Eyes Open group on Facebook or MeWe. Our community would love to connect with you there. And as always, I like to start with a pointless question of the episode. So Baldini, I was hoping you could share with me.
Good. I stopped hearing you. Oh no.
Weird.
Okay, now I can hear you.
There was like a severe interference that sounded like a freight train was driving through my microphone.
Really?
I don't know if anyone else heard it.
I heard silence. So
weird.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. So what was your pointless question of the day?
The pointless question was going to be, why are people beating the shit out of each other on the streets over differences of political opinion?
Wow. Well, you wanted to just change the episode.
Well, I was like watching these videos today and I'm like, there's endless examples of these protests happening. They're usually counter-Trump rally or counter-Trump protests of some kind. And somebody will walk by, not even part of the protest, with like a red hat on, and a whole group of people will surround them and beat the shit out of them.
Well, like, yeah. It's why it's a tough question. I think these are hard things to know. Yeah, no, but we talked about this briefly on our last conversation, how I think we've been, programmed to, and programming, I think is the right word there, to see ourselves as, we can go all the way back to ancient scripture, that all the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes. So everybody has this myopic view where they don't see themselves. And so in their worldview, they're correct. And that has always been the case. But I think what has changed is that they've ratcheted up the amplitude such that by extension, anyone who disagrees must therefore be bad and wrong. And as they've done, as we've seen over the last few years, what's now been called the cancel culture. I used to call it Twitter outrage. But where there's this mob mentality of ostracism and shaming, public shaming of anybody who doesn't toe the line. And we talked about this before, the sort of, again, cult-like mentality where no one's allowed to have an individual opinion. If you don't toe the party line in every aspect, then you're going to be outcast. So now we've become comfortable and accustomed to the idea that anybody who is not on my team is somehow the enemy. And it's a classic Hegelian dialectic divide and conquer mechanism.
This is what drives me insane about it, is I'm like, even if you just desperately disagree with these people and you really think that they're the enemy, beating the shit out of them does nothing for you, and it completely ignores that they have no power just like you. I mean, I actually think everyone has a lot of power, but in this system, we're meant to feel as though, and we definitely have a dearth of power compared to the people who are holding the reins. So, we're like, we're succeeding. We're making their plan succeed for them.
Yes,
especially when we use physical violence against each other.
We only serve their interest in every aspect of that, because we're fighting against each other when the power is really ours and should be pointed at the true enemy, which is them. Yes. And violence is really not going to improve anything. And it seems quite clear to me, like they're there's an intention to try to get people to overreact and snap, so that there's an excuse to, again, have more governmental control to say, you guys can't control yourself and we're going to have to step in and
the
moderate
layers
the
of
situation.
irony are so profound in this, because that's exactly right. And it's the people who are doing the attacking are calling the other people violent fascists.
Yes.
But they're attacking these
they're the
people
ones
out of
doing
nowhere.
it. Yeah.
And then they're asking to be, most of the people are all, the people who are committing this are often also asking to be disarmed. And so then they're also saying, like, we trust like the government to be the only people with guns. And yet these same people in the same protests will then go and confront the police.
Right.
Like, you're literally trying to fight the police also, who are the people who you say should be the only ones who are armed, which is insanity. And then they're creating, I don't know, there's just so many levels of irony. It's like driving me insane today.
Certainly within my lifetime, and I see evidence of it much prior to that, over the last 200 years, again, that I can see, that almost all of Western society, insofar as I can tell, has moved from well-considered rational thought and rational argument for taking a position on anything. If you look at again, even though I don't accept the story as it's presented, the founding fathers, and if you read any of like David McCullough's books on John Adams or 1776, about when there was a lot of dialogue, Jefferson and Adams and all these guys.
Actual debate.
Actual debate. With due respect, regardless of feeling, where, as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things, right? When he defended the English, the Redcoats, right, in the Boston Massacre. So we've gone from a place of critically thinking and examining the merit of the argument,
or at least valuing that.
Right. Well, certainly now we don't value it, because the immediate thing is to shut up and you're a racist, you're a Nazi, right? They shut down any debate that's settled science. So gone from any sort of logical, rational debate with grace and dignity and decorum to an entirely emotional, knee-jerk, immediate reaction, not a response, but a reaction. Yeah. And you see this well played out. I mean, a great example of this was a couple of years back, the gal from a British PR firm who jokingly sent on Twitter before she boarded a British Airways flight to South Africa. She said, "I'm going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Ha ha. I'm white." It was in poor taste, but
it's hilarious for how stupid it is.
Yeah, it's not very bright at all for somebody who held a management position at a worldwide marketing firm. But before she deplaned in South Africa, in Johannesburg, she had lost her job because the Twitter sphere went crazy at that rate. So, and you see it, again, I mentioned during our last conversation, how quickly I see, as soon as I see a news report come out, I know about a dozen people or so who will immediately say exactly what they're supposed to say. They do a kind of, it's sort of a virtue signaling thing. How it's like, how programmed am I?
It's like a proclamation of like a lot allegiance or something.
Yes, it's very weird, and I struggle to really understand how anybody can't see it, how they can't even look in the mirror long enough to see that they're reacting in a really unusually high energy, high emotion way to something that really they lack any real evidence, or the only indication they have of they've been told something in the news, right? And with very few details, and they've got their minds made up about it. And so I go back to the very first thing I said, that we have this idea that we are, I mean, this is to me a longer story. I think this is this is a big story about what I think about the whole idea of the forbidden fruit and what the tree of knowledge and good and evil was all about. But essentially, to me, it that made us into our own little god, right? And it's sort of the result of the limbic system, how that first gatekeeping mechanism of all of our senses, we take in all of our senses and we have to make sense of things, and it has to do with consciousness. And so we don't see we don't think about all the different aspects of sound and sight and balance and touch and heat and sensory. We don't think about it. It all kind of gets put back together, and it really happens in that space behind our eyes, right? It doesn't happen at our ears. It doesn't happen at our eyes. It happens in that space where we put all those things back together and try to make sense of things. And the internal narrative is what kind of goes along with that. There's this sort of internal narrative that happens the whole time as we're narrating our own movie there. And in all of those cases, we're the hero, right? We are the hero in our hero's journey. And so all of our behavior is justified, no matter what it is. Even criminals who get caught and they know they've done wrong according to the law. But if you only understood, right? If you don't know me like that, right? So we all have that sense of that. I don't think anybody is free from that or immune to that. We all have a sense of being self-justified in what we do, and so. Again, to answer your question, the long-winded version is because we believe we're right, but we've been pushed a little further into believing that anyone who disagrees is then the enemy, that they're wrong and inherently bad and morally bankrupt and should be pushed out the door. And I see a lot of evidence that the political theater of the macabre, as I call it, has been a kind of proxy for that. That they set people up as sort of like this person represents all of you people, and then they behave in a way that's egregious and atrocious, and then they can by proxy equate that to everybody else and say, see, you people are just like that because you support it, and it goes in both directions. And so it plays on people's natural prejudices. And again, we talked before about how people sort of are drawn to people like them. And so they have a tendency to want to become a part of something. And so they're going to gravitate toward a group that thinks like them, or at least they can be kind of an in group with. And now there's these dividing lines. So you've got kind of the left and the right and some still in the middle. And then you've got this whole truther movement thing that's kind of happening, which is it's interesting to see. But the answer to your question, the why is maybe a little nebulous, but I think ultimately to me it comes down to because they told us to be that way.
Yeah. And this ego thing, right? Because like you're saying, you're the hero in your own journey and you see this perceived enemy that you've been trained to hate. Then if you go attack them, you're the valiant person who tried to stop evil. And what a good job you've done to fight for right or whatever. And I'm just like, I don't know. I like one guy in one of the videos I watched screamed at the person who was one of the people who was punching somebody in the head. He said, "This is a human being." And I was like, thank God for you. I mean, how many people in that moment are going to remember their higher mind and not devolve into just mob mentality? And people have been injured really badly. And anyway, that pointless question, my pointless questions are almost never pointless. So, but it did a good job of sort of like reviewing the types of things that we talked about in the previous episode that you were in. So that's not a bad thing. And
there's
this
a
episode,
method to your madness.
Yeah. And this episode, we wanted to get into linguistics. So as well as other things. But what do you want to start with the field of linguistics? Like, what have you studied in linguistics, or what are some of the key concepts that you've taken away, or what interested you to talk about that?
Well, there was a number of things. I've always been a lover of words, and I love language. I love how it. One of the things when I was growing up, and I realized kind of early on, there's sort of this left brain, right brain, and the left brain is much more concrete, and mathematics and science and physics kind of go in that category. And the appealing part to that is that it often has a concrete or predictable outcome, and the less concrete, more abstract ideas, where you get into language and poetry and writing and artistic expression, is fluid and is subject to interpretation. And I like both of them very much, and seek for balance. But I've always loved words and using them and understanding language. I'm illiterate in a number of languages. I speak fluent sarcasm.
Yeah, me too. Half the time, at least.
Yeah, right. So what kind of has occurred more recently is in conversations with Crow and a few other people. That has a lot to do with looking back at history and trying to understand how the standard narrative, the Scaligerrian history, is a fraud and is hard to tell exactly which parts are what. I mean, I
nearly impossible.
Yeah, I think it just goes without. Just we can get to a point we know that we've been lied to, and it's hard to kind of put it back together. And so we can just say what we know is that it's just not. It's not accurate what they're telling us. And one of the things that came about as I was doing some research into The Secret Life of Water, an episode I've been studying over 2 years now, to do with Jason and Crow on the Crow 777 radio podcast. And it's a fascinating topic, and it goes really super deep, and it appeals to much of the things that I love, everything from physics and chemistry, and there's just so many aspects to it.
I wonder if did you happen to watch the episode of Rogue Ways where we talked about water?
I did.
Oh, okay.
This is long before. I mean, so again, is it
similar though to those types of just random all the weird things?
Yeah, you guys touched on a lot of little things of it. And there was a couple of times I was going, oh, you almost got there. Okay, yeah.
Oh, we should have had you with us.
No, it's because I mean, there's a lot of speculation and stuff. But again, where I kind of came at it was from a very strong physics and chemistry background. That's kind of the first segment. But then there's a lot more esoteric things, right? And some of them you touched on that it has memory, and there's a number of things. But in looking at it, I was going back again through the history, and one of the most the Scaligerrian timeline gives us a lot of these ancient heroes of different kinds that are set up as they were the ones to whom they attribute a lot of the mathematic and scientific findings. Well, a lot of different things, but there's usually one person. And so when you go back to when you look at water, one of the people you have to look at is Archimedes, the Archimedes principle, and he was credited with a lot of different things, and so. Clearly, it became evident that his narrative was suspect in terms of his death and how that occurred and which things are attributed to him. And so, he's credited with a lot of things in terms of density and buoyancy and water displacement and the Archimedes screw, and he did all these things. And it just occurred to me, I'm looking at his name and I realized the etymology of that is, arch. So it's the ultimate, the top, the keynote, the keystone, right? And medes, media, medium, the central. And I mean, it just becomes clear he's the central primary bridge. And okay, yeah, he's the bridge between the old knowledge and the new knowledge. So we attribute it to him. And I went, well, that's kind of a poke in the eye, isn't it? I mean, isn't that a little suspect? And in looking at it, I realized he was supposedly a peer, a contemporary of Eratosthenes. And you may be familiar with Eratosthenes, who's the one credited with doing the sticks and shadow experiment that was supposedly determine the radius of Earth, and that it was using a well and a stick or sticks and shadows or whatever. Eratosthenes is credited with having determined the radius of the Earth to within like 5%, and
I must have heard this story, but I didn't remember that.
Yeah, so they use that. Even Neil deGrasse uses that as a proof for the Earth's rotundity.
Neil deGrasse.
They always yeah. So this is one of the first things that they pull out. Well, a couple of things are pretty apparent that. So when I was this kind of got me looking at it. It's like, well, with just two of those things, again, you have a presupposition that the Earth is round without getting too much into that. The same model works whether it's an infinitely distant sun with parallel rays and a curved surface, or a close sun. The math works identically. Yeah. You can't determine it without having three positions. And there's a lot of
nope, actually that's not what science says, so you need to be murdered now.
Right, yeah, right. So and then there's the question of how did he actually do this? The story again, the narrative changes between sticks and shadows to shadows in a well, that he paced off exactly 500 miles, that he paid some guy with a camel to count steps between the two places. He did it 1 year, and then the other year it's like, well, how would you know? Because solar noon is not the same as the kind of timekeeping that we do now. And so it just didn't make any sense. But immediately I was like, well, the one interesting thing is that neither Archimedes or Eratosthenes mentioned each other. And that would be unthinkable if they were contemporaries of one another. They would supposedly be, it'd be like Larry Bird and Michael Jordan both writing memoirs and not talking about each other ever.
Yeah.
It's preposterous. Right, unlikely. And the other thing was that I was mistaken about just like the spelling of his name when I looked at actually how it's spelled is Erat, Eratosthenes, and I was like, wait a minute. And again, you go back to Greek etymology, and erat is the root word for error or errata, erroneous. It's a mistake. It's false. It's a mistaken. It's untrue. And then Osthenes, I wasn't aware of this until I started looking at it, is in ancient tales, it relates to a fake magical world, an alternate reality, a made-up world, much like we would say Narnia, for example, or Utopia.
Right.
It's a world that doesn't exist, and it was used as a setting for explicitly mythos type tales, but not the kind where they were talking about the actual gods and goddesses that they claim to have been, the Greek or goddesses, the pantheon of gods there. Those claims were that they were in our space. That this was just like a different space where it was a place you could write a narrative about some alternate world. So it's like a commonly known alternate universe. But so even in his name, you have the basic meaning of false world.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh my God, it's a poke in the eye.
Wow.
So these things kind of, made me blink a few times. And again, in some conversations, one of the things that I noted was that we keep being told that Latin is a dead language. And when I had to have a foreign language in high school, and I chose French because I thought it'd be fancy with the ladies. Oh yes, oh, je suis ravi de connaissance.
Yeah. So romantic.
Oh yes, it's very nice. And I could have taken Spanish, which would have been much more practical, but I felt like, oh, it's beneath me. Again, I was a bright kid, but not very smart. And then Latin, which was a dead language, so it was like. But of course it's not dead, and but we keep being told that it's dead, and in fact, if you look at the Wikipedia entry for, like, they say it officially died out in like 450 AD or something, which is preposterous.
But there's a reason why the elite of the world have schooled their children in Latin for centuries. Right?
Yes, there is. Yes, in fact, that's the primary nature of why I really started taking it on a little bit more, is because so that's observably false, because most serious academic works were written in Latin all the way up to the
entire
mid-19th
scientific
century.
Language is also based in Latin.
Yes, so everything medical, legal, scientific, all of it has Latin roots and is still used. So clearly, and again, the official explanation for that as well, it's just sort of a throwback. It's a sort of a vestigial
remnant
thing, right? And but then again, even until I think it was the 1970s, the official liturgy in the Catholic Church still had to be done in Latin.
Right.
And so these stories don't add up. And when they're giving you multiple stories and saying there's a detour sign or closed, a keep out sign, those are good reasons to get curious and investigate.
Straight in there. Yeah.
Sure. So, and again, I'm not as I say, I'm a little bit of a polyglot, but I say I'm illiterate in a number of languages. But I'm not a professional linguist or anything. My daughter is an English teacher, if that helps. And I had an aunt who was she taught comparative languages, but in any case,
well, you're far beyond me. I have a touch of Spanish and an even smaller touch of French, and a very, very slight encounter with Latin.
Yes. So, but here we are, right? Is that, and this is the kind of the point for me of wanting to kind of share the word, is this is a topic really for people who have the time and interest and want to go look themselves. I can't, teach the whole bunch of stuff. I just want to give you some ideas of what I found and how to approach it, or at least, get the wheels turning a little bit. Is it, so when you look at so then the question comes is, well, then why are they trying to bury Latin so hard and tell us it's a dead language that died 1,500 years ago, and yet it was still clearly in use. In fact, the first public school in the United States in the 1660s was the Latin school in Massachusetts, right? So that was a public school, was the Latin school. So clearly it wasn't dead in 400 AD.
Yeah.
So when you look at Latin, one of the things that comes out is that it is what we would call an inflected language, and by that we're not talking inflection like Asian languages where an inflection changes the nature of the word into something else. It's not a verbal inflection.
Right.
What that really means in this context is that the meaning, the intention of the verb is carried in it, and so. In English, for example, we would say he ran. That doesn't tell us anything about. So we would have to use a different word, for example, to describe that he was fleeing, right, running away, or that he pursued. He's running towards something. So whereas in Latin, the intention is carried within the verb, and in English, here's for example, is like. Sentence structure is a key aspect to understanding. It still can make sense, but it's kind of gibberish if you change things around. So we have the subject, which is the noun I, you, right? He ran. So if you want to say, for example, the dog saw the lion, you could say, you could kind of move the verb around, say, and you'd sound like Yoda.
Saw the lion, the dog did.
Right. So you kind of move things around, and it kind of works, but it makes it a little bit nonsensical.
Right.
In Latin, the tense of the verb is, and the intention is carried within it. So in Latin, it wouldn't matter which order you put those words. It never. So if you change it in English, you could make it say the lion saw the dog, but in using it in Latin, there's no. It doesn't matter which order you put them in. It's still going to say that the dog saw the lion. Right? Doesn't matter which order.
Right.
You can, for certain purposes of iambic pentameter, or to make it more poetic sounding, or for purposes of clarity, you can rearrange the order such that it's more pleasing to the ear, or brings something else out. But it is really just a slight change in the presentation of the word. You change the form of the verb, and that changes both the gender, because it's a gendered language as well. So we have the male and the female aspects, but it also implies the intention of the verb. And so we'll bookmark that. That's a really key thing, right? Because when you're speaking it, then you're carrying your intention within the word, and there's meaning there, right? And so we say that words have meaning. So that's one aspect of it.
Yeah.
Another huge aspect to me is that there are so many idioms and phrases within Latin that are much higher minded than you would find in almost any other language, especially English. But there's an enormous amount of
play,
things.
Creative play.
Well, I would say that there's just little phrases like what we would say, idioms, proverbs, things like that is much higher minded, right? So even when you say in vino veritas, in wine there is truth, right? That's a fairly profound saying, and so you can have just little sayings like audax et filius, bold but faithful, right? These are really well thought out ideas, right? So that would be in common use. So in English, a stitch in time saves nine, or bird in hand worth two in the bush, right? We have these little sayings, and a lot of times we sort of lose the meaning, or we say, oh, it's just become cliche.
Like toe the line. Nobody knows if they're
Right.
meaning like towing the line, like you're dragging it with you, or you're like
Right.
putting your toe on the line.
Toe on the
you're
line,
ready
right?
to go. Yeah.
Right. And so it loses its meaning, and then they start. Then not only is there a semantic drift where the meaning of the word changes, like nonplussed is one of those where its real meaning, nonplussed would be that. Well, back up today. Now it's used nonplussed. It's like I'm unflappable, right? I was unconcerned about it.
Yeah.
When it really means the other, the opposite of that, right? So what it really means is that plussed, you would be happy or a positive, and so nonplussed, I had a negative reaction to it.
Huh.
But it has
That's
now
just like literal, right? Like now literal means figurative, like
right?
and other degradations such as that.
Yeah, exactly. So like literally, I was on fire.
Literally, I died. Like you
I
did.
died literally.
You're right here. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I literally died.
No, literally, I died. Well, unlikely. So yeah, so we have gone through semantic drift. So there's that, and then you've got words that cross over, and a lot of people get into this wordplay when we say words have meaning, and they'll try to break things down in a way that really is a little bit nonsensical to me. So I've heard people, for example, say, "Oh, forgiveness means to forgive as before." No, it doesn't. That's not how it goes. Or so we'll, for example, when looking at the legal thing and say, oh, the birth of a ship, birth canal, those things do have a connection. But then you'll get other people who really try to push that, and they're really stretched to make words say other things, and it's not quite that simple. English is a derivative language. We've brought it forward from a mixture of a whole bunch of other different things, and you really do need to look at the etymology of the words and where it came from to get a better sense of that.
One example is people are saying pharmacology comes from like something about magic and whatever, and I'm like, no, if you look at the roots of the Latin roots of it, that's not actually what it means. I don't remember what it was, but they have the wrong root. But yeah, you do. You have to know if it came from German or if it came from French or if it came from where did it come from?
The claim that it's to do harm. Well, again, it would be like here's a joke, right? So a couple goes over to Munich for Oktoberfest, and everybody's drinking, and they're kind of walking through the park on the way back to the hotel, and they see this guy. He's drunk, and he's pissing in the shrubbery there, and she goes, "Gross," and he turns around and says, "Danke." Okay, so that's a bilingual joke because it's gross means big in German, and so he took her he took her expression of disgust as a compliment. So so you have to look at the origin of the word and where it actually comes from to really kind of make sense of some of these things. Now, is there potentially sympathetic crossover to some things? Yeah. Probably. I mean, we discussed a little bit last time the sort of interconnectedness of things and how, at least my view on how a lot of these divination things and sort of how it works, that these interconnectedness, that things are, again, that's my take on largely on much of gematria, is that they sort of are resonant with one another.
It's almost like happy little accidents.
Yeah, but they're in the same way that musical notes or tones have sympathetic harmonization and resonances with other things. They're like will attract like. So two things that are similar will somehow vibrate or have a sympathy for one another, and then that will reveal itself within the language. And again, if looking at the difference between, say, English gematria, which is, again, it's kind of a bastardized languages, versus say Jewish or Hebrew gematria, it's a very different thing. And yet oddly enough, sometimes there's a good deal of crossover there. So it seems like there is a there or a little bit of smoke to go with that fire. I would just, again, caution people to not try to take things apart in a way that just doesn't make sense on the surface, because it kind of lacks credibility. And I mean, again, feel free to hypothesize and
I mean, you can say like, well, maybe this is like this, and there's some evidence, and I'm not sure yet.
I always err to the side of caution about making claims without ample evidence to back it up. Can hurt your case over the long term. But anyway, so this idea, so there's this Latin thing, right? So to me, ultimately, I get to this, that Latin was intentionally withdrawn from widespread use, accepted by the elites for a couple of different reasons. One, because it contained high-minded thoughts, and I'll express a little bit more of this as we get into the idea of linguistic determinism and relativism as a concept. But because it contains some of these high-minded thoughts, and it has all these idioms, axioms that would cause you to think about these higher-minded ideas that are not contained within other languages, and that it expresses intention within the verb, and to the degree that what I see the role of, again, here we get to some of the woo, but the idea of magic and manifestation of the will, that when you go to the ancient descriptions of creation, in every culture, almost without exception, what you find is that the creator being spoke things into existence. A couple of them have he sung it, which I find a really interesting take on it. But there are none of them which just expresses that it was thought or he took something and turned it into something else, other than for with the exception, for example, of the Genesis story where he took clay and made man or whatever. But the idea that all these things were spoken into existence, that by speaking, it creates it amplifies the intention of the will to create it. So again, within scripture, says the power of life and death is in the tongue, and these things I think are reflected throughout a broad scope of different worldviews and traditions.
Theme reoccurs over and over and over and over. Yeah.
That it's not just the thought has will and power, but the spoken word is many more times powerful. That when you speak a thing, you give it life and bring it into existence. And in fact, there's you see a couple of memes going around for Halloween, because we're close to that time of year, where people saying they can't speak Latin because they're afraid they'll accidentally summon a demon or what have you. And but I was curious about this, and so I began to do some research. And in fact, looking at, for example, grimoires, which are
spell books.
Yeah, spell books. Yeah, exactly. And there are very few in any other language, less than 24 in English, a few in Spanish. There's some in.
Can I guess? Can I guess? Can I guess?
Yeah, go ahead.
They're going to be in Hebrew, in oh my God, Arabic, and in German.
Sanskrit. Yeah, Sanskrit
or Latin.
And Latin.
Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
So Sanskrit and Arabic, and the kind of there's some translation stuff there, but Latin far and away more. There was more than 234 that's available just free online now. If you just go looking for grimoires online, it's available in the digital domain anyway.
Just don't read them out loud.
Don't read them out loud. You know what you're going to bring up, but. I think, again, correlation does not equal causation, but it stands to reason that if the one of the biggest controllers of information, again, in the modern world that we're aware of, is the Roman Catholic Church, and they have their big store of archives and that sort of thing, and they use, again, Latin as their official language. They prohibited people from not only owning copies of scripture or other books, but from speaking Latin. And then they made vulgar Latin for people to speak until they could come up with other languages for them. But again, they considered for most of their history, and I think there's not too big on the ins and outs of that, but I know for the longest time they couldn't do liturgy in any other language. Now they can do it in the local language, but any of their rites aren't considered properly blessed or whatever unless they're actually done in Latin. So any of their
you can go into Catholic churches all over the country and find
High Mass is always done in Latin. Yes, but again, any of their rites, any of the rites and traditions, if you're doing exorcisms or any of those things, or last rites or any of that stuff, must be done in Latin, or it's not considered valid. So again, there seems to be a lot of evidence that Latin in particular carries with it the ability, or certainly it is a better language for expressing verbally the intention and will of the person who speaks it. Because it is this inflected language, and the verb carries the intention within it, whereas other languages aren't. So it seems to me pretty clear. I think, again, I can make a pretty clear statement that Latin was intentionally withdrawn, not by natural attrition, but it was withdrawn from broad spread use because it does contain power. And here's the thing that I want to get to as sort of the broader scope here is the idea of this linguistic determinism, that language in itself, to a large degree, shapes the cognitive thought process of the speaker.
Absolutely.
So there is, sort of linguistic relativism, which is a much weaker version of that, which simply states the idea that the language that you speak influences your thoughts to a degree that it is cultural and societal. So, for example, we use as an example that in Inuit language, there's 34 different words for snow
Right.
because it describes different things. And in English, there's maybe four or
Qualities.
five. Yeah, you've got a blizzard, you got, a smattering, you get sleet or whatever. Yeah, you just get a light dusting. We have a few words, but they have many different. In Greek, you had 7 different words to express love, the types of affection, and in English, you have kind of a contextual use. And again, with a lot of semantic drift there. Oh God, I love tacos. Right. It's
Yeah.
not the same. Or I love when they do that. Right. So there's that sarcastic view. But so there's a kind of a weak corollary. There's sort of a weak influence that the words that we use, the language that we speak, influences our thoughts based on our culture and popular language. And then there's the more linguistic determinism that really is a much more strong idea. Basically states that it to one degree confines and to another degree shapes the neuroplasticity and thought process that you're capable of having because it defines the thoughts that you're going to have and the ideas you're going to have, because you must keep in mind that all language is an idiomatic representation of a thought and a concept. And so we're expressing, yes, we're expressing a concept rather than a concrete thing. And even some of those words, again, in English or in lots of different languages, and we'll talk about this in a moment, can bring up different ideas. So if you say bank, a lot of people will immediately think a place you put your money, but a snooker player will probably right away go for a bank shot where, a fisherman was going to be on the bank catching a fish. So there's a lot of different interpretations you can do there, and there are again some crossovers and some insidious things. My wife and I were again earlier this evening just discussing some of these and how, for example, invalid and invalid is the same word
with
why? Slight
that
semantic.
Always seems so rude to me.
Yeah, slight semantic drift. So
you as a person are invalid.
Yeah, invalid. Right.
Jesus.
You don't matter. And so, we have produce and produce, right? So these are not entirely dissimilar, but they are different meanings for those words. Yeah. So when you look at different languages, and the more you become familiar with the way languages are not only put together, but how they're used, and I find it, for example, curious that, or not, right, that we're not taught these things, where these are ideas that were well known to even not that in the distant past, that different languages were better for different things. For example, French is a language that is very suggestive and kind of, in many ways, likes to, well, it likes to skirt the issue. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Gotcha. So, for example, there's the phrase, it has a certain je ne sais quoi. And we, the basic definition of that is that certain something, that certain ineffable something. But literally it is, I don't know what. Je ne sais quoi. I don't know what it is. Right? Literally, I don't know what it is. But it's in the context, it's used as that certain ineffable something, right? So there's that expression. So it has built into it a kind of a lot of wiggle room for interpretation. You're suggesting things, hints, innuendos, allegations. It's a good language for that. And the French were long known for their sort of diplomacy, but we would consider international diplomacy sort of the. I didn't really say that, right? So politics, it's a language of politics. And for many for many years, especially through the late 19th and early mid 20th century, French was one of the preferred languages for international law because it left these big gaps of interpretation. So a company might have good reason for corporate law to choose French as the language to set up a non-disclosure agreement, for example, depending on which side of that you are on. On the other hand, you have a language like German, and German is an awkward language for English speakers, certainly, because it puts the verb at the end, and so you have to wait to find out what happens. The man with a dog at 75 years old lived in his house for 75 years, died. Right. So you have to wait till you get to the end. But what they're sort of infamous for is the sort of precision of their language. What they don't do what we do in English, which is to use adverbs and adjectives to modify a noun to tell you a red car, right? So in German, it's more likely the word becomes a compound word, which includes those attributes to make it a very specific thing. We laugh sometimes, right? So we would say, like the bathroom, no, der Pissenzimmer, literally the piss room, or the Scheiße house, right? It's like the shit house. But it becomes a compound word, and sometimes 3 or 4 attributes can be put on and make this very long, crazy German word, but it's very precise and specific. So it's a great language for engineering.
Engineers, yeah.
Yes, it's a great engineering language because it is unmistakable and very precise. And that is another language.
That's a direct, they're good engineers. It's just not
exactly.
Even racist. Their culture has always been very good at engineering.
Swiss and Germans, right? So known for engineering, and it was another language that was, again, for a time, it was one of the top 3. Still is. There's the top 3 languages for international law. German was another one because it was very precise. So the opposite of French, being very sort of loose and subject to interpretation, right. German is very precise and doesn't leave those gaps between the bars. It's very precise. And this is exactly what we mean when we say this. You cannot, if you misinterpret it, that's on you. So it's a language for that. And English is
just crappy and horrifying.
Yeah.
I've always said, because I'm an author, right? I'm a lover of words, and the part of what I love about language is that it's never ever going to be good enough. But really, that's probably just a factor of me speaking English primarily, right? Maybe there's a language where I could say exactly what I mean and describe. I know that you're going to understand exactly what I meant. Whereas now it's so imperfect. I have no idea. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to hope that you get it.
Yeah, it's very imperfect. And in times, I would, to my view now especially, it seems intentionally that way. And in part by virtue of the aggregation of a lot of different words. We've assimilated so many different things from so many different languages. And as we said earlier, some of them can have similar sounding roots, but it doesn't mean quite the same thing. And so, so the study of etymology and where the root word comes from is really a key part of, some of your discernment there. With the caveat, I would always say is, look past Wikipedia for crying out loud, because,
it's not a bad place to go. You just have to you have to question it, and you have to see how much further you can go.
Yeah, I use it all the time, but I assume, like most things, that it's going to be that's the official narrative.
Yeah.
Right. So if it's anything that's controversial at all, then almost certainly they're telling you something that's not true, or they're misrepresenting it at best.
Or it's Snopes. It's the Snopes of dictionaries.
Exactly. It is the Snopes of dictionaries. And it is, if you start looking with any closely at all, it was proven a number of times, and this was as early as 2011, that it was the idea was supposed to have been a kind of an open source that people could go on there and make edits, and that you had moderators that would make sure people weren't putting retarded things in there. But I had done some work for a data company for a minute, and somebody got curious, and somebody's Wikipedia page got a bunch of edits, and they would change things that would keep changing back, and they were looking into it. And somebody did a gateway search and discovered that a ton of, not just with that page, but then they got curious and started looking out, but most of the edits, and they had come up with, a good chunk. So more than 25%, I'll just say that. I don't remember the exact number, but more than 25% of all of the Wikipedia edit IP addresses came from Langley, Virginia.
Huh.
No,
I was like,
Nothing to see
Oxford.
here. Nothing to see here from
Mhm.
Dr. Evil. So yeah, so I mean, if you know, it's not paranoid if they really are out to get you. No, I mean, if you can kind of demonstrate that this is one of, you know, the alphabet agencies are it's a tool, it's one of their tools. It's, you know, I think it's pretty easy at this point also to go back and follow the money trail like anything else, and see that Facebook, Google, Twitter, pretty much all of them were seeded and funded from the very outset
By
by the intelligence.
Alphabet Inc.
Yes, well, not only Alphabet Inc.,
Alphabet.
but the yes, the alphabet agencies. So the intelligence agencies, it literally always was, never has been. It's not like they've been infiltrated. It was literally set up from the beginning to be a data gathering tool that people would willingly throw their data into, and so they could use it for metadata mining.
And we did.
And we did willingly, right? And
Happily.
but I mean, you know, there is something to say we're using it as a platform to help wake people up for the most part and stay in touch with each other, knowing that you're in a room where there's cameras and everything you say is monitored. I mean, you should be aware of it, but it's going to happen anyway, right? So that sort of is what it is. But so back to this idea of
English being intentionally created to dumb everything down.
I think, you know, not just English. I mean, we know it because we speak it, and it certainly is again, it's an amalgam of a variety of different languages. But you can certainly watch. It doesn't take really even an astute observer to see that over the last 150 years, the number of words in use has shrunk to nearly, it's less than a third of what it was just 150 years ago.
Like, we're seriously on this rate going to be speaking in grunts and like, I do this, you do that, like really fucking like.
It is horrifying.
I'm just disgusted today with everything.
Yes, it's horrifying, and you know, one of my minors in college was journalism, and so I've always, you know, again, language. I've always had you know, just a love for storytelling and really the idea of expressing an idea with clarity and using what I always call word pictures, right? Drawing on the idea that you can connect with somebody else's experience and get them to visualize in a way to help them really understand and empathize with an idea or you know, these idioms and these, you know, ideas that we're trying to express with language, and that sometimes using a more direct, explicit, concrete term, especially ones that are overused, can draw forth in a person, if they've had a negative experience with it previously, then they're not going to, it doesn't evoke the same response that you'd intended. So for, you know, example, you know, one that gets brought up a lot, and again, stepping on your toes, is that the idea that in explicitly in Christianity, they refer to the Creator as a father, and if you have had a very bad experience growing up with a abusive father, that's not a great thing for you, right? So you interpret it in that way.
Right.
So it's or even the idea of you know, of money or sex or any of these things. If you've had a bad experience with it, it doesn't evoke the same luster with some people as somebody else. So even a very direct, explicit, concrete noun may not get the kind of result that you want when you're trying to express an idea or tell a story.
Right.
And you know, my experience is generally that if you want to, I don't even want to say convince but I'd say convey an idea that for me, what I want to do is to try to convey an idea with clarity to somebody else, so that they at least understand. I don't necessarily need them to agree with me. I don't need that validation. I just want to know that they understand it, and then they can evaluate it on its own merit, and that's fine. But I want to express these ideas in a way that we can share. And one of the things that, again, we talked about before is the commonality. And one of the things we see in relationships is we tend to base most relationships on the foundational aspect is, what do we have in common? You know, right? And even if that is that we're curious about what we don't know, and so we become friends with somebody who's completely different, but we're both curious about what we don't know. that we begin with what we have in common. And so with my experience, for example, with teaching adults, is that adults often will start off with kind of the classic arms folded, defensive posture, that you're not going to tell me anything exactly.
Yeah.
You're not going to tell me anything because I know this. And especially if, especially when doing anger management classes for people who have been adjudicated there by the state, that's the last thing they want to hear. They don't want to be, preached at by some idiot.
I'm not angry.
Yeah, I'm not angry. Sure, problem. So, but with any topic that you're teaching to adults, you got to start with something that everyone can sort of agree on. So you begin with the things that everybody understands, and then you kind of work out from there. And you have to be patient and sort of build on those foundationally. So you're working from a place that everybody can has a common denominator and sort of work forward to where you can kind of get the head nod and yes, okay, this makes sense. And then you kind of move forward from there. And that's the process that I use when sometimes trying to explain these more unbelievable and incredulous crazy conspiracy theories, is to go to things that make sense and something that they will probably agree with, and then work forward from there so at least they can understand the idea.
Yeah.
So when we're using language to express that, again, often my idea is sometimes, especially when you're trying to get somebody to understand a feeling, is to, I would say, draw a word picture that sometimes doesn't approach the subject directly. If I want to tell somebody that they hurt my feelings about something, I go, hey, imagine if you were, and then put them in a different situation and say, then this thing sort of happened to you, and like, well, how would that go? And they can tell me how that would make you feel, and they're like this and this, and then you can relate it back and go, yeah, okay, that's very much how I felt when blah blah. And so you're not putting them in a defensive posture where they immediately go, oh, I did this because you did. They can separate themselves from it and put themselves in, again, that narrative transportation, and sort of get the idea and understand what that feeling is like. And then, you sort of spring the trap, I guess, if you want to say it that way.
And then, like, sometimes it backfires, though. Today, somebody was saying, you can't criticize Greta, she's a child, or some nonsense. And I said, okay, so if a kid came to you and was proposing pedophilia be acceptable in our society and that we embrace it, would you not criticize their idea? And they just said, well, you're a troll. Sure. Okay, never mind then.
Yeah, and
it was a bit far. I know. I took it to the extreme.
I mean, I would say from my perspective, I'd say, Lindsay, the only problem with that is that they were already triggered. So it didn't matter what you said, that they were going to push back. And it wouldn't matter if you said, hey, your mom is the best thing ever. And she said, I don't care what my mom says. I hate my mom. Right. So they're already, once they're already in a defensive posture, we go back to where we started this whole conversation, is that the response, the response is emotional, not thought through. And we're not using logic and reason and rationality to make decisions and to determine what our actions are going to be. And
disappointing.
It is. It really is indeed. But yeah, the idea of this that language determines our thought processes and the control of it. And especially what I see now is that, again, over the last 150 years, the number of words used in newspapers of record has fallen dramatically from upwards of 180,000 words that were used regularly to down to less than 50,000. So almost a quarter, where it's less than a third of the number of words used in newspapers of record on a daily basis. It's
terrifying.
Stunning.
This is what Sophia Smallstorm told me when I had her on the show a little while ago. She said that, the average person's vocabulary has shrunk to something like, I don't want to quote it because I don't remember the exact word, but it was hundreds. It was something like 200, I want to say. 200 words.
It seems small.
It seems really small. And she said that there was a dog recently that had 200 words. So I was like, whoa. Sure.
I mean, if I remember correctly, and again, I could be wrong too, but if I remember correctly, I think the estimated average adult today, so we're talking 25 to 42 demographic, has about a 16,000 word total vocabulary.
That makes me a lot happier.
Of which they're probably, though, only using maybe 2,000 to 2,500 on a regular basis, and some of them they don't know.
I
But
wonder if that example that she was giving was more like writing or something. Because I know when people write, for some reason, their vocabulary is smaller.
it could be, or it might have been
rather than what they can understand if they hear.
Potentially, or it could be that there are depends. I mean, depends on what, again, because statistics are always,
Yeah.
lies, right? So there's lies, damn lies, and then statistics.
Right.
We have that going. But if I remember right, that number sort of rings a bell in that about like again to the 80-20 rule. I think about 80% of the words that we use are less than 500. Of most people use the primary choice of words that they have that they use on a daily basis is less than 500 words.
That makes sense. More sense.
And I think the total amount of words that women speak in a day is sometimes somewhere between 15 and 20,000, and men speak between 8 and 12,000 words a day. And the joke there goes is because women always have to say it twice. What?
Because we have to have the last word, and it has to be extensive.
Right. Well, and then there's me, right? I use a lot of them. Yeah. I barely let you get a word in edgewise. I apologize for that.
No, that's awesome. You make my job easy.
I'm always fascinated by everything. Every time you jump in, I'm like, yes. You're totally on it. But yeah,
see, that's easy for me. I get to just find random connections and throw them in. You're the one who has to actually provide the bulk.
Oh dear, we're lost now. Now,
yeah.
But no, this is certainly what I see is that the limitation of the words that we use and the semantic drift and changing, in some cases intentionally changing, like we discussed before,
right.
the use choice of the word progressive
right.
to describe the far left, or even in terms, and here's again another trigger topic, is using the word pro-choice rather than pro-abortion or whatever. I mean,
yeah,
it really masks and becomes a euphemistic. It avoids the context of what's going on there and softens it. And the use of political correctness, which began insofar as I can see in the late 70s, that kind of became when you started seeing things like challenged, got these hyphenated words got added, so intellectually challenged, physically challenged instead of handicapped, and now we get all these ridiculous words that are just sort of made up. But what it also does is it opens the door to creating a false dichotomy that you open this whole dialogue with, Lindsay, which is why do people hate somebody else? Because it puts a positive moral spin on one side, meaning that anybody who disagrees is then amoral and bad. So if you're not pro-choice, well, then you're anti-choice, right? You're against the right to choose. Well, that's, again, without getting into any of that argument, right? That's not my point. It's the language that's used there. So then
it's the prescription of language too, right? And when we say prescribed, there's like a little word magic in there, right? Because we're prescribing the language you're supposed to use. We're proscribing. We're drawing a circle around you and containing you in there.
That is correct. It is proscribed. You are absolutely right. And so without understanding some of the nature of the words that's used, there are lots of shows and YouTube channels out there going specifically into this topic of how legalese is a very devious form of language magic.
Yeah.
If you really want to do this,
trickery.
Where it is trickery, where you're getting people to agree to something that they don't understand the nature of the rules of the game. So you place out the Masonic checkerboard and they think they're playing checkers, and really the other side is playing chess, and they're not telling you the rules of the game. And they go, "You understand?" Yes. And so they seek consent. And this is exactly what happens when, for example, if you get pulled over by a law enforcement officer. The way they phrase their questions is they're getting you to agree to consent, when really you should keep your mouth shut without getting into that topic. If you have an encounter with law enforcement, just keep your mouth shut. The more you try to help yourself, and that's what they try to get you to believe that, if you're innocent, then you're going to be forthcoming. Again, the first thing they say is anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. It's part of the Miranda. They will use it, and it's been over and over. It's been upheld that they can lie. They do it all the time. They tell you they have, again, without getting too far into that, what they're getting from the beginning is to trap you with your own words. They'll say, and I've seen dozens of these so-called confessions where they'll say to a person who is, for example, mentally challenged or not in a proper mental state, especially after keeping them awake for 36 hours and peppering them with questions, and they're dehydrated and tired, and they're confused, and they've just lost a loved one, and they say, I don't remember what happened, right? I don't know. And say, oh, okay, so you were just mad and you got up and you and they go, I did? And they take that questioning thing, but they transcribe it as I did. And then they say, oh, you did that, and sign it down here. And then they rephrase the whole thing to say, they'll rephrase the whole thing. I did, blah, 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 and just fill in the blank because they just flip it around, and it becomes a confession.
Dirty.
So it's dirty, dirty, dirty tactics. And much of the legal system, and I keep saying we don't have a justice system, we have a legal system.
Yeah.
There is no justice involved, and it never was intended to be that way. Neither is law enforcement intended to be that way. It is law enforcement, right? So words do have meaning. Force is the root there. To enforce is to use the threat of violence or other means of coercion to get you to comply with something. And that's what law enforcement is, right? So they're seeking consent so that they can pretty much do what they want. And it's, when they protect and serve, it's not you they're protecting,
no.
serving, I promise. And again, this is not hating on cops or anything. Again,
no.
What we talked about
I
before.
think most cops intentionally go in to try and do good.
I don't know about most, but I will
Maybe
say that
most.
I'll say, people are complex and people do things for a variety of reasons. And a lot of people, similar to military, they go in believing they're doing the right thing. But after a while, I think that, compromises happen over time and slippery slope. And many of them may even still believe that, again, sort of like the Jesuit thing, the ends justify the means. And so all for the greater glory, right? So they feel justified in doing reprehensible acts because, they're keeping the people safe from, and nobody ever really goes through and walks through the logic and says, really, what did you actually do to keep anyone safe, right? That it's preposterous and it on its face. Safe. Right, exactly. And you kept the state safe from anybody uprising and saying, hey, you don't have a legitimate right to rule. And so if anybody has any questions about that, yes, that is my take, is that no government that I'm aware of on earth right now has a legitimate right of rulership because there's no consent. However, without getting too much into that,
I do not consent.
I do not consent. Right? So anyway, the idea of this is that so you ask if I think English is ugly, and the case has been made by a lot of people that it is a bastard, ugly language. I find beauty in it still.
You can create beauty out of many things.
It can be. It can be. Well, here's a way I would say is that, so I described earlier that French is a language of sort of mystery and implication and subject to interpretation. And German, for example, is a very precise language that is very concrete, where English is a language that it's a good descriptor language. You can use a variety of adverbs and you can describe things, but it is really very poor at discussing emotions and matters of the spiritual or the internal world. It's really it's very poor at that. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's one reason why it has been chosen as a primary language, although it's third in the list of languages used per capita worldwide. No surprise, the first is Mandarin, Chinese. But second is Spanish. There's a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, but there's so many dialects that none of them can really talk to each other. I recall a friend of mine who she was at some gathering in Honduras, and the speaker, it was a very upscale meeting and dealing with science, and the speaker was from South America and was talking about reproductive habits of something, but the word that he used was in not in the context of Honduras, but from where that she was at in Mexico, it was a vulgar slang word. So it would be, as someone would say, copulate, but us saying fuck, right? So
Yeah.
so it was just
She's
it's
like,
like, you know, you
"What?"
had a particular group of the crowd that went, "Ooh," that this person said it, and everybody else is like, what's wrong with, why are you people? So I'll tell you, it's an interesting arrangement there, but they all spoke Spanish. So we find this to be true. And again, I find that English it's a good language for describing things visually. It's a good visual language to describe how things look, and to a lesser degree how things work. But it is very poor at describing, again, matters of the heart, emotional things, or the very abstract, unseen things. You try to describe freedom, or you try to describe concepts of consciousness. We began to struggle really quickly on finding good words to express these ideas without running smack into um, uh, some again, what I would say, the materialism that's been put upon us, so that the only acceptable things are hard, cold, material, hard, concrete things, and that anytime you get into the more ethereal or esoteric, now you're getting into crazy and woo. Right. So
Mhm.
anything that is beyond the physicality of senses is then, that there's already a sense of uh, condescending on that,
Yeah.
and
Dismissal.
yeah, dismissal, and that it's not to be taken seriously. When again, if you go back and look further to the ancient philosophers, that was the primary question to be answered. So we talked briefly before about philosophy, philo being love and Sophie being wisdom. So the
Yeah.
love of wisdom, philosophy covered all of what we would consider now like all of learning, natural sciences, and everything. And that the ultimate question to them was, who are we and why are we here? And now that it's considered the stupidest question, like, well, that's for hippies, right? But
it's seriously like, what are you doing here?
right, and
Like,
but
what else would you want to find out
to the
about being here
right
before
to
you
them,
die?
the whole point of learning anything about the physical sciences, the anatomy, astronomy, geology, the whole point of learning any of that was to give you clues
To
and
point back to the point.
exactly
Yeah.
evidences to support.
And that is weird that when you look into all of those, it does seem to point back to the point,
It
when you get
all
deep enough into any of it.
it does, if you approach it with a multidisciplinary, holistic view.
Good
The
point.
other thing that's been done, especially within our lifetimes, and again, I see a little longer than that, probably about 80 years, is more of a siloed, compartmentalized
Yeah.
specialism.
Oh,
Uh,
we praise compartmentalization. We
yeah,
celebrate it. We're like, you're so specialized in this one thing. That's what you've
one
studied for
thing.
12 years.
Yeah.
But it's like you're an idiot in every other way. So
Especially within academia and sciences, within medicine,
medicine
it's
especially.
expected now
Yeah.
to be a specialist and to not have any other thing. So the idea even that someone would get into medicine and not study nutrition is, to me, just like incomprehensible. It
Yeah.
does, it's like learning about car maintenance, but you're a specialist in, a rod, and you have no idea how a transmission works, or if about fuel. You don't know how it actually works. You only know how this one part works. It just seems
Which it's
ridiculous.
just like that whole saying about like if you're a carpenter or the whole world looks like nails or something. It's like that. Like you're only going to see that part of what you have been trained in. You're not ever going to be able to solve a problem, especially in a system like your body.
Especially in a system. And this is, to me, what I've been most grateful for, is that I did early on, from a very young age, have interest in just a wide variety of topics. And
Yeah. I've
I don't
never
know if I
understood why you wouldn't want to know more about anything.
yeah, and I don't know if
Literally.
I discussed it with you. I know I have with a couple other people. How I went through a period between the age of about 9 and 13, was really depressed, and I gave myself a diagnosis of what I call Da Vinci's disorder. He was one of my favorite guys, and again, can't even say for sure now if he was an actual
Right.
person. does seem
But
like
the idea of him is really neat.
the idea of him is great, but he was into so many different things and didn't get to complete hardly any of them because we're limited by time. So my depression came as a result of understanding that the one of the first things that became apparent to me is that every question that you answer leads to 10 more unanswered questions that are more difficult, and eventually it will all go fractal, and you can't really know the answer to anything, and there are so many things to know that you will. I was like, I immediately realized I would die before I knew anything, not even one thing, right? That I would certainly face my mortality before I could understand anything of value.
But all those different spheres that you're learning about, the interconnections that you see between those spheres, are that's where like the true knowledge is. And what is that quote? I don't remember where it's even from, or who said it or what, but the idea that if you knew everything about one thing, then you would know everything.
Well, I think there's some truth in that. That yes, you would come to a place of understanding.
Because just like you said, any one thing you learn, you're gonna have 10 more questions. So if you knew everything about that one thing, you would know everything.
And this is in part why I will say that from my perspective, that certainty, absolute certainty, is the imminent domain of fools and frauds.
Yes.
That
Let's scream that again for the people in the back.
Yeah, right.
If you're sure about anything, you're stupid. Okay, you're not stupid. You're acting like a fool.
It's Dunning-Kruger for sure, right? That you lack the very core competency that is required to even understand. Like the guy who, to begin, you don't know that you don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And then you know that you don't know, and you kind of go along there. It's the person who doesn't know that they don't know that's lost. Right. So
there's known knowns and known unknowns, but there's unknown unknowns.
Right. And the unknown unknowns. And to not know that you don't know, you're not even aware that you don't know.
Right.
But that's where most people are. Right. They don't even realize that there is anything below the surface to even look at. And so they're satisfied with the answer, and anything beyond that seems crazy to them, that there should be anything further. And so I look for this in anybody that if I'm interested in watching a podcast or listening to what anybody has to say. I listen pretty quickly to see how they state things. If they're speaking with conviction, but as a matter of conjecture, hey, this is what I've come to. I'm pretty convinced of it. I accept this. Or it's a matter of truth, and anybody that doesn't buy it is an idiot. That I will toss it out pretty quickly, because one of the first things that you realize when you begin to study anything deeply, anybody that has any real intellectual honesty, is that you accept right away that you don't know. Like, as soon as you begin to
no one else does either.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as you begin to know, you realize that not only do you not know, but it can't be known. And then anybody who claims that they do, again, is a liar or a fool. And so when scientism, the guys in the lab coats, stand up and say we've got it all worked out and the science is undeniable and you guys are science deniers and the debate is over, I know you're a liar, because I know you're probably not that stupid. I mean, you might be deluded, and there's a possibility of that, but for the most part, when they take these really hardline positions, they're going to mock and denigrate anybody who even questions, much less challenges these ideas. They're defending an indefensible position. That's the reason they need to shut down any conversation about it. In the same way, if
anyone is mocking and denigrating in the first place, your argument isn't sound enough for you to stand on, because you don't have to mock anybody in order to shut anything down if your idea has merit.
Absolutely. And as I said in our prior conversation, truth will never fear any investigation. It welcomes investigation, because all it can ever do is to confirm the truth. So anybody who tries to prevent that, similar to the idea of, again, the Vatican having these hidden archives, they can't be any moral, they can't have any moral high ground by virtue of that alone. Never mind the Inquisition or all the pedophilia charges. I mean, just that one thing says that they're no friend of humanity if they're going to keep knowledge from people.
Excellent point.
So anybody who is trying to keep knowledge from you, or prevent the debate, or prevent anybody from asking questions, is trying to keep you from knowing truth, and they're not your friend.
That's what bothered me about the flat earth thing when people were freaking out and they're like, oh, these idiots, and this is how far we've come, is that idiots get to question the shape of the earth, and oh my God, what's happening? And I was like, you should be happy if that
Absolutely.
anybody's considering anything and thinking about it and trying to use science and mathematics in order to understand it better. We should be happy. We should be using that as a teaching moment, even if it comes in a classroom or what, there's no, if you're so sure the earth is a globe, you have nothing to fear from people questioning whether or not it's
I'd say
flat.
this the same thing it's true with almost all these things that use the term science denier, whether
Yeah.
that's vaccination, whether that's climate change, whether it's the shape of the earth. Everyone who's using the term science denier, I'm telling you, is on the wrong side of that because
Yeah.
anyone who has looked into any of those things with any diligence and an open mind, um, no one that I know who has studied vaccines will take them.
Yes.
No one that I know who has really looked into flat Earth can come away.
Sure.
They come away going, well, I don't know what it is, but it's
I
not a
don't know what
spinning
it
ball,
is.
right?
Right.
But it's almost certainly not a spinning ball.
Yeah.
Um,
Unless
if
it's
you
just immensely like beyond even our wildest imaginings.
who
Maybe. I don't even
knows,
think then.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's again, as I've said before, I'm an agnostic when it comes to that. I admit that I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't prove things. I have some hypotheses that seem to work for me, and I have to be comfortable with where I am at that, and it makes sense
Yeah.
to me. Um,
For your own sanity, you have to be able to say, like, given my information so far, this is where I'm most likely going to stand. But I'm
yeah,
totally willing for that to change if something comes up that
yeah.
causes
I
it to change.
I accept that I'm probably wrong on most things.
Yeah.
From data anemia, I just don't have enough to know for certain. But based on what I know, here's the most likely scenario that makes sense to me. And
Right.
until I get more information, I'm comfortable with that. I'm also comfortable
Yeah.
with saying, because I know I don't know, I'm going to look at any information, regardless of how crazy it sounds. In fact, the more crazy it sounds, the more likely, in my experience, the more likely chance it has to be of having some potential merit to it. I mean, there's
Truly,
some things that are
it's
just like crazy, like unicorn farts or whatever. But on the other hand, so we use that as a joke. But then again, so many ancient cultures had drawings of unicorns. There's
yeah.
probably something to it, right? Dragons and that sort of stuff. It can't be, to me, it can't be a myth because so many different people, ancient cultures that were supposedly unconnected, certainly by time they were disconnected, had similar descriptions of it. So
Right.
this
Because even if
tells
it
me
was
that,
symbolic, like, what other examples do we have of a ubiquitous symbol?
right, why would you come? So yeah, we have the serpent,
Yeah.
we have certain things that repeat over and over, and
Mm.
it's this sort of pattern, and what we were talking before about pattern recognition, it's
Yeah.
this sort of thing. And this gets to the root of really how we learn and what neuroplasticity is and how we learn as humans is by
Yes.
aggregating and grouping things within our mind in a way that makes it's all about sense making, really.
Yeah.
And so we need the world to make sense to us, and we put it together in a way that at least reliably makes sense within our worldview. And the narrative, if you really look pretty, with any to me any depth, at the overall narrative that we're given. What they do is they break it down into specialist and into components, and so each component on their own, okay, and then he gets to a point where, I don't really know the math on that, or I don't really know the history, and sure, these are smart people, and we're taught to accept authority
Mm.
as being, and then if we can repeat that and remember it, then you're smart, and so you get the cookie. But when you put it all together, and again, have this holistic view and an interdisciplinary approach to it, and when you can see patterns that reappear across different scientific disciplines, then it indicates that there's a validity to that pattern, that there's meaning and sense there. So, for example,
Yeah.
you see the golden ratio appear across a variety of physical manifestations.
Mm.
You know that there's something there. When you see the Fibonacci sequence reappear in nature, then you can begin to look for these patterns elsewhere and know that there's a there, that there's some, when you look at a series of primes and see that these numbers repeat, at least within a 10-base system. And then if you start looking at other, like an 8-base system and 6-base systems, what you see is the universe begin to open up even more there. And so really this idea of Tesla's, again, of the 3, the 6, and 9, there's a lot of stuff there, and then you can get way off into numerology. And I think, in my view, again, a lot of people put more weight into it than into, again, each aspect of it. Each is a part, right? There's a part of it, and you need a lot of different food to have a balanced diet. So a steady diet of ice cream will kill you. It's really tasty. I like the ice cream, but it won't sustain you. So from my perspective, again, a wide variety of things. In some cases, I would say, especially the things that you don't that you're resistant to or don't like. So if you're naturally better at the abstract stuff, and you like English or language, art, and you don't like math, try to be disciplined enough to get some math into you, so you don't have to rely on other people.
Because like you're saying, that pattern recognition, like when you go into some especially area that you weren't otherwise familiar with, or you thought you were bad at, or you didn't like for some reason, you often will find, when you explore it more, that like you'll find a pattern there that you didn't see otherwise, you wouldn't have seen otherwise, and it'll reconfirm some other things that you've seen in other places. But you also there's a joy there. I think we're taught to hate things by how horrifying school is, the educational system, and then we were taught to think things like, I'm bad at math, and it's like, maybe, I know there's people with different proclivities to different things, but really what it comes down to most of the time is practice. If you're exposing yourself to it long enough and practicing it enough, you're going to get it, and you may find that you actually enjoy it. So especially if you have this idea given to you from school or education that you're bad at something or that you don't like it, I'd suggest that you revisit it as an adult and try to teach yourself some more of it, because you could find all kinds of amazing things.
Yeah, and it's a natural human condition to not want to do things that you're not good at, because you don't want to be mocked and you don't want to look like an idiot,
and to not really try very hard to do things that you don't see as benefiting your survival or something
of no value. Sure.
Yeah.
But I think that as you said, there is an immense joy and satisfaction in learning to do something that you thought you couldn't, or you thought you were bad at, even at a basic level of competency. And it gives you a great deal more confidence, and certainly self-value, right? And to me, that's one of the biggest things. If I really get back to the nature of people, which is to me one of the most fascinating things, right? Is that people are fascinatingly complex and weird and beautiful, and I love it. And can be ugly too, but they're just weird. And I like weird. I am weird, so I'm drawn to the weird.
Us? Right? No, we're not weird. Right?
So, so for me, I'm fascinated, by the human creature, and consciousness and the nature of it, and just weird things that can't be explained. Like most people probably are familiar with this phenomenon, but I just had it. Just talking to my wife about it earlier. So like, what is consciousness, and like, for example, what happens when you sleep? And I know the phenomenon I'm talking about is I can be hard asleep and nothing will wake me up, but if she or anybody comes in the room and stares at you, you'll wake up. Okay, they didn't make any sound. So how did I know? So clearly it doesn't come to me from my eyes or my ears, but something in my consciousness was aware that somebody was staring at me. They can pass through the room and be quiet and do all kinds of things, and it won't wake me. I won't stir. But if they sit there and stare at me, I will immediately wake up. So what is that, right? There's a phenomenon there that certainly is beyond
it's beyond our understanding of perceptions, right? Right. There was a moment I was in a cabin in the middle of the woods, totally far from other humans, and I was sleeping, and I woke up to nothing, but there was someone on my porch who then tried to get into my house. There was no sound at all. So whatever woke me up was definitely not sensory based in the way that we understand it. It was consciousness in some way, right? Because I can be asleep and someone can walk in the room, but somewhere in my mind expected them, so I don't wake up, I wake up in the morning and they're there, and I'm like, oh, okay, you came in. I didn't wake up at the time. Sure. So that wasn't sound, it wasn't movement, it wasn't, whatever it was something beyond what we understand.
Yeah, and I think everybody's had the experience where they think about somebody and that person calls.
Happened to me today.
Right? Or I haven't heard a song in 20 years and it comes in my head, and then 2 minutes later it's on the radio.
That one freaks me out. I'm like, did my brain pick up the radio wave, or like what happened?
It's a very weird phenomenon. These are
It's
things that
strange.
have happened to everybody, and yet we're
Yeah.
told to simply dismiss them as some mere coincidence. And yet it happens so frequently. It is like a red flag or somebody going. I don't know if you're very few people seem to be familiar with the old Steve Martin movie, The Man with Two Brains, Dr. Hafarar and Hamelmahe. It's a funny movie. It's just a farcical thing. But there's a funny moment where his wife passes away, and he's got a portrait of her on the staircase, and he meets this other woman who is she's a bad character, but he's drawn in by her, and so he's standing there. He says, if you don't want me to do it, just give me a sign. And no, and the house starts to shake, and he's like, really, any little sign? No, and the picture starts spinning, and he's like, okay, so give me a sign. I'll take, whenever you give me. So he's consciously, right, ignoring the huge red flags. And this is like, to me, the universe screaming, hey, there's more here,
There's
right?
more,
There's more behind the curtain. And every effort is made to poke our eyes out and blind us. Like one of the things that really, there are just a few things that really get my goat and anger me. And for example, one of them is how quick they are to try to kill us and to prevent us from taking our place in this world. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but certainly in Western world, the moment that you're born, they, in addition to cutting the umbilical cord right away, and all that implies that there's it really should there's a whole thing there where really that connection should keep going so that the baby gets more nutrients from the mother. Yes, and so it helps them work out all the trauma and blah blah. So it's really bad for the baby to snap that and cut it right away. But the first thing that they do after that is to put silver iodide in their eyes, and what they say is that to prevent conjunctivitis, which is nonsense because like less than 0.3% of cases would ever have had conjunctivitis, and with modern
0.3%.
Yeah, and that's before they started doing it in the 1940s, and with the modern sterilization process, there's no way it would ever happen. But what that does do is, they always say, oh, well, all babies' eyes are turned blue, are born blue. No, because they put the silver iodide in their eye, that the silver turns it blue, and I think it literally. Again, I don't have proof for this, but what I suspect, because of what I've looked into it and the metal and what it does to your eyes, is that literally it blinds you from being able to see.
Because it makes you more sensitive to the light.
Yeah, but I think it literally blinds you from being able to see, to really see. They blind you from birth so that you cannot see anything that you shouldn't.
I can't even express like the deep hatred I have in my body right now when you describe that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It makes me want to kill people.
I started by saying there are very few things that really upset me in the way that does. And that's one of those things that makes me so almost crazy.
Because the mothers don't know this. Nobody's going into this like, oh, I want to fuck my baby over. Like, this is what we've been told is the best way to go.
Yeah, even the nurses and most of the doctors don't.
No.
It's tradition, and tradition is peer pressure from dead people, right? So it is they're just told, just like most of them are with vaccines, right? They're just told, and so they accept it because we accept that what we're told is being the truth, and why would they lie?
Well, so it's part of that, like, that short sight or that tunnel vision that we are, the compartmentalization that we're encouraged to have leads to this type of thing as well. Like, well, I was told to, and this is just what I've done. This is I'm just regurgitating all the stuff that was shoved into my brain.
Never looked into it. I know I don't need to. And, I only took enough organic chemistry so I could get my medical license, right? So I never really looked into what it does and the nature of it and what chemicals and
why cut the umbilical cord so quickly? Why? Exactly. There was this moment where I brought this up to a couple people I know who are nurses, and I said, what if you left? I didn't even say like you should or you have to or it's wrong or it's right. I said, what if you just left it for a little bit longer? And they fucking freaked out. Like, they got super emotional really quickly. And I was just like,
you can't do that.
And I just stood up and walked away because I was like, I can't even believe how emotional you just became at a question. You
So
know, you could have
what?
just answered the question and said it'd be horrible and here's why and here's all the, but they just attacked and became really emotional. It was weird to me because I don't think either of them were very, I don't even know how to explain it, like emotionally connected to the, I don't even think that they had thought about it before that moment. That's why it shocked me. It was
Well,
just
and that,
suggesting something that they'd never considered before, like
these are the sort of
it's
programming
extreme.
roadblocks and triggers that
Yeah.
I began to see right after investigating the shape of the Earth. Is asking other people. Like initially, I was a little confused by it. I was like, I got, I was like, hey, some of the stuff doesn't make sense, and I couldn't work through it. I'm like, maybe I'm just doing the math wrong. I'm not carrying the
You're like
one or something.
genuinely curious and
Yeah,
asking.
it's like
Yeah.
there's something, it doesn't make sense, and like why can't we see too far? And I
Yeah.
started, looking into the nature of light refraction and stuff, and going, okay, it's not that, and so really was curious, and so I asked a couple of other people. I go, hey, you're pretty bright. Like, help me figure this out. There's something weird here, and the immediate like rage, just rage, and I just backed up and went, what is that?
Yeah.
And with prior experience in the mental health care field, I knew right away that indicates that something has been placed there to prevent it, and without our knowledge. And in a similar way,
Yeah.
like one of the things, for example, and we can continue to use that as an example. I'm sure, again, really upset people who are not into the topic, but
Yeah.
on the shape of the Earth thing is how quickly they start with that indoctrination. It's one of the very first things that
Very
they
first.
teach you, and it comes along with the idea that people, the ancients, were so dumb that they trusted their senses and they just imagined it to be flat. But now you're smart because and so if you even question it, you're dumb because they
Yeah.
were dumb, and you don't want to be dumb like them, and it's crazy. So anybody who thinks that is crazy. And so now they've created this false dichotomy link, that you're dumb and or crazy if you even question those things, because of course we know, because we're smart now. And this
It
one.
also dismisses any possible wisdom or knowledge from the past, right? Because
That's
we're
correct.
instantly like everything from the past is dumb.
Right, and that is one of the major things that I see that leads to this this modern overwhelming Dunning-Kruger syndrome among people. Again, from the programming that we receive in school and the way that it's presented, that you're encouraged to accept, and that you're discouraged and in fact punished for even asking questions. Just look, we already know. Just
Yeah.
right.
Just
There's
shut
no
up
there's no
and
more land to
repeat.
discover. There's nothing else to learn here. We already know. Just repeat, and we'll explain why later, and then they never do. Um, so there's not only that aspect to it, but there's I think a far more insidious and subtle um, control mechanism, again, where the illustration of the crabs that will prevent each other from crawling out of the pot, that we will prevent other people. We don't, and it's a complex thing. We don't want to be
Yeah.
wrong, and we don't want to have our beliefs challenged, and so
Right.
we're not going to let anybody else do it. And I see, other than those who seem to be really paid agents when it comes to some of these ideas in social media being expressed, that the biggest thing I see among actual trolls is really, I see fear. That
Yeah.
they need to be right and smart, and it terrifies them when clearly bright people are telling them, just look into it, and
Yeah.
you'll find that those things aren't true. And then they get angry, and they start with the ad homs right away. Oh, you think you're so smart, and you're smarter than Einstein, blah, blah. Like, well, if you look into it, Einstein really wasn't that smart. Um, and the ideas weren't his, and he was the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day. He
It was
what
like controlled.
Yeah, he was a
Agent.
character. He was a character, and so without again getting too much into that, these insidious ideas of sort of self-governance that they set us up to uh, protect our own prison. We become our own guards in a way.
Yeah.
because the narrative has to stay intact. And that's one of the biggest obstacles that I see to people awakening to the idea of, I think, any of the rabbit holes, is that once you go down one, the possibility opens that they could have, well, if they lied about this, what else would they lie about? And then
that's where I think the true fear is
that's
that if I question this, then I might have to change everything I think and do.
And I know that it is firsthand and through observation that it is an enormously grievous process to not only deal with the anger at being lied to and how much of your time was wasted, and just like this idea of the silver iodide being put in the eyes, how just wrong that it just at its basic level, just the affront to humanity. When you back up and look at how wrong it is to not only steal wisdom and understanding, but to lie about where we came from and who we are, and that those guys were smart and we're the dumb ones, and they've conflated this thing and turned it on its head to make people think that technology means that we're smart. But we're now the smart culture because we can use a tablet or a laptop. Well, in fact, every bit of data shows that it's the opposite. It makes you dumber because it's
and we have the best computer before it was ever made. It's in our fucking head, and we don't even know how to use that.
And one of the aspects, for example, of we get into the topic of syncretism and ancient scripture and who copied from who and a bunch of ideas that were shared. And one of the things that's again seems intentionally ignored is that most of these were oral traditions before it was written, and for many of them there was the inherent idea that writing it down would somehow corrupt it. And and that what we talked about before, the difference between knowledge and understanding, is that knowledge is having the information, and understanding is to be able to integrate it and to have firsthand experience of it so that you can actually use it. You can't really use knowledge in the way that you can use understanding. And that their ideas were that that two things happen. And again, this idea of how language and thought interface and intersect with one another, is that adepts they had to learn tens of thousands of lines of these stories, verbatim and perfect with the inflection just right. And their idea was that not only, again, did it carry with it the power of the word, the spoken word, and the will, and they were in each retelling of the story, they were in essence a bit more casting the spell and making it a more manifest thing. So as
like reinforcing the morphogenetic field or something.
Exactly right. They're reinforcing it, but that also it sharpened the mind of the holder, and they knew already. And this was, this goes back to before Common Era times, that once they relied on the written word, they would then forget the actual words because, again, the brain being smart, it
knows
it will bypass the information to say, I know where the information is. So I don't have to actually remember it. I know where it's kept. And so they would naturally not be as able to recall as quickly the actual words verbatim if it was put down on paper. And the only reason that some began to do it, and many people were outcast for this in these small groups that, the scribes and that sort of thing, these the druids and the different groups that had these oral traditions, people got in trouble for doing it, but they were trying to preserve it because they were being one by one, they would become persecuted, and they would try to kill off the information by killing off everybody who knew it. And later the Catholic Church was part of that, but this has happened all throughout history. So it's not so when they say the New World Order, that's another lie. It's the oldest order ever. It's the same basic synopsis, going as far back as we can tell. They use the same symbology, the same symbolism, the same methods, means, iconography. It's all the same. They put a different name on it, and they even from time to time appear to be at odds with one another or competing with one another, but it's all the same stuff, really. But the goal, the same elements always seem to be to again, divide and conquer, to destroy knowledge, to replace it with a false, fabricated narrative, a pseudo-truth, if you will, to misdescribe and to isolate a person, not only from himself and his meaning, and we'll get back to that. The philosophy, right? Who am I? What does it mean to be here? Why am I here? And what is the nature of this place? And it's like that question has been inherently scrubbed. And as I talked to you about it before last time, and listening to the lectures of McLuhan and Huxley and a variety of others, and they were having these academic conversations, it seems to have abruptly stopped in the late 60s, where these questions of higher mindedness were not even discussed anymore. That really, once the saturation of electronic media reached a tipping point in the mid 60s, that conversation went off the table, and it was replaced with just sit in front of a television.
Isn't it interesting that, so this idea that, writing reduces your sort of skill or your abilities maybe, and that's externalizing this knowledge, right? And then now we're in this age of like ultimate materialism, whereas, everything's externalized. And in the past, if you had this memory that you could remember all of this and speak it, that's all within you. It's internalized. And like, I would say that back then, the emphasis, even when you're talking about saying like, who am I, this philosophy, it's like the emphasis is like on your internal self or your soul or however you want to think of that. And now our emphasis is on these external things, and we have no soul. In fact, you're ridiculed if you believe you have a soul, almost, right, especially in this like hyper materialist age. So yes. I just that ultimate divide between sort of the internal and the external, and the material and the spiritual.
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I think if anybody has any question over the differences between, our supposed knuckle dragging Neanderthal ancestors and our supposed really clever, we're the smartest person, society now, go talk to your local Starbucks barista. I'll avoid a barista, right, or your grocery bagger or whatever, and talk to them for a minute, as long as you can take, and see what's on their mind. And then there's a few YouTube channels. One of them that comes to mind is Voices from the Past, and even through through translation and the loss of context through translation, there's a lot of short readings. Most of them are under 5 minutes, of letters or statements written by people. A lot of them, they go back to extant documents as far back as they can get, but things like Julius Caesar or Hannibal, on the meeting with the opposing general on the battlefield. Listen to the words that they said and the thought process behind it. You compare, contrast, and compare, and then move forward. Go to things that you can easily get your hands on. Look at letters of people writing back from the front during the Civil War, or during World War I or World War II. These are supposed to be, again, like farm boys and people without any real education, and not only their handwriting, which is again amazing compared to what we have now in terms of penmanship, but the thought process.
My handwriting has become atrocious.
Oh,
you can't even recognize it.
I'm so sorry.
I can do better. I just don't.
But yeah, if you look at these things, and one of the things that I loved about I was fascinated for a while, again, before really looking at too closely at the history of our country, but letters written back and forth between Abigail Adams and John Adams when he spent a number of years over in France trying to get support for the revolution and for the new nation. But the letters that they wrote were of such a completely different mindset that my first response to reading letters written from Abigail during the middle of the deprivations of war, and when fighting was within 5 miles of her home, and she had kids there and stuff, and the sacrifices that were again apparently being made. But my first response was that I was so ashamed of us as a nation, and again, this is 15 years ago, I guess, when doing
it's worse now.
It's way worse now, but also I don't care about the magic. Yeah, but also I don't care about the magic sky cloth, right? And I realize that now historically we are the bad. This nation is the bad guys mostly. We're the baddies, right?
Are we the baddies?
Yeah. I saw that movie. Yes, we are. but yeah, just the mindset of the people is so categorically different, and to me it seems that the further back you go, the more lofty the ideals become, and to where and the further forward you go, the less command of not only the language but of thought
Yeah.
is in use, and that there's not even any thought process. And I mean, recent studies that got me just horrified was to see that upwards of 30 or 40% of people didn't have an internal dialogue at all. I can't even imagine what that and that's what
I
led
don't
to the
even
rise.
understand
Right.
what
It's
that
what led to
means.
the rise of the NPC meme, right? Is that there was a study that came out of college, mostly college students, but a variety of different people. And it wasn't a very big sample size, but they showed upwards of 30 to 40% of people had no internal dialogue,
What
right?
do they have then?
Nothing.
I don't understand that.
See, I'm the same way. I'm like, that can't even be.
Yeah, I
But
don't even get that.
the more I read the data, I was stunning that they
What are they
really
doing in their head?
nothing.
What? That's not
It's
possible.
it's entirely reactive. So it's entirely or stimulus reaction.
I'm
Uh,
like freaking out right now. You're
yeah,
freaking
no.
me out.
Yeah, you have to study for it. You have to study it, but it's out there, and that's what gave rise to the NPC meme. That's the
Wow.
history of it. Is that literally they're like non-player characters. They people are like, what are the implications? Do they have no soul? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
It
Okay. I didn't know the NPC thing had a basis in anything. I had no. This is the same as someone told me a little while ago, also on a Rogue Ways episode, and I forget which one, but they said that some people can't visualize something, and
it's
that
weird.
freaks me out just as much. Like, I don't understand how you couldn't construct a visual in your head of anything you want, unless it's something you literally have no. Even if you have no reference, the words have a reference to you. So, like, I don't understand that, and I really,
It's
really don't understand how you
it
don't have.
seems incomprehensible to me.
I don't get it.
Because most of my world has long been multiple narratives in my head, and it's like trying to pull them all together into something
Like
that I can express to
constant.
somebody else. Yes,
Yeah.
and I mean, maybe that's to some degree, again, different
Excessive.
people are different, but I know that most people that I know, it's common to all of us that we
Yeah.
have a narrative, and we're constantly talking to ourselves, and sometimes that's a negative narrative that we need to work out, right? That we
Yeah.
have a
Not always
profoundly
good.
it's a profoundly negative take, and we're mean to ourselves, and so that's another aspect should be looked at, but the idea of not having one
Of
at all,
none.
I couldn't grasp it. I really thought it was a joke. But the more I looked into it, it's actually legitimate, and again, the implications are stunning and frightening.
Yeah.
That it is for more and more people, especially the younger group, that it is really a reactionary. It's entirely reactionary response to stimulus,
So
and
you're just a
so
machine at that point.
yes, yeah. So and that goes then and again back. All we can tie it all the way back to the beginning of your first question. Why are people doing this?
Jesus.
Because they're not they're incapable of having rational thought because they can only react.
This is the most terrifying day of my life. So,
I'm so sorry.
no, it's good. I should know.
I feel
I
really
want to
bad.
know this because now I want to understand it more. But shoot, what was the question I was just going to ask? Okay, do you think that that's always been true, or do you think this is a new phenomenon?
No, I think it's absolutely a new phenomenon.
Thank God.
From my perspective, and what and to a degree, again, going back to the studies that were done, that a lot of again, I point a lot to McLuhan because he was specific to this topic on how electronic media in particular affects the nature of neuroplasticity and mental development and cognition.
Yeah.
That the more electronic media that you're exposed to, the less cognitive function you're capable of. And these studies were done for people, initially dealing with radio.
Way back, yeah.
That again, using theater of the mind, and once they kind of turned their own, what the result was is that their inner dialogue, their self-narrative turned off and was replaced by this external narrative. They were listening to somebody else and agreeing with that and absorbing it as though it were their own self narrative. And when I worked for a period of time in radio, I discovered this weirdly to be true. And I think most people who have had a public life, or anybody who has exposed themselves in a way where other people believe they have spent time with them, so they think they already know you.
That's true.
Right? But then you also have this other group, and why many air personalities, at least back in the day, it's less so now because much of it's automated. But back in the day, when you had radio DJs and stuff, most of them did use a what they called an air name or a pseudonym. In part, a lot of them had weird names, McCluskey, it's just weird, Kowalski or something that would be weird to say. So they, but largely because there's a certain number of crazy people out there who will try to track you down, and they think they have a relationship with you because they've spent hours with you. And the really nutty ones, to them, you are the voice they hear in their head. They literally have replaced their own self-dialogue with you. And so you become, or the object becomes sort of like a godlike to them, and very important. And this is where you get a lot of celebrity stalkers. They believe they have this intimate connection with them based on this time that they've spent through this electronic media. But that was part of the basis of what happened, is that people would turn off their inner dialogue and replace it with an external dialogue, and listen to that, and they absorbed it. And then when you got the media of television, again, part of the functionality there is that it's an active participatory media, in the sense that unlike film, your eyes absorb it in a way more naturally because the light is reflected and coming into your eye through a reflected source, versus a television or a screen. It's projected, and so it's coming directly into your eye, and so your eye actually has to raster that, put it all back together, and it causes a sort of atrophy of the muscles in your eye, and so you can't hold your view on something for a long time. It makes it much more difficult to read, for example, or to have long attention span. And so in addition, so that's just the one aspect, not including all the other aspects of the flicker rate that immediately puts you into an alpha wave state that's very suggestive, pretty much a hypnotic trance. And then all of the subliminal things that we catch, that's put in little frames in between frames that the subconscious mind does catch and absorb, in addition to the narrative transportation that they use to get you to emotionally to connect to these ideas and to internalize them. So they've got you in about 10 different ways when you look at these electronic media sources. But the studies also show that the younger that you start using these devices, the more deleterious it is to your cognition. So that we now have they began pushing the idea in the late 80s, the baby Einstein, that you're going to set your toddlers down, or the Teletubbies, set your toddlers down in front of a TV and it'll make them smart, when it actually does exactly the opposite. It prevents their cognition from working. They can no longer use imagination because it's all been external stimuli, so they cannot imagine or do fantasy play. Like, that's part of the again, you said that people can't visualize something. That's part of the process that we go through as a toddler phase, is this play and visualizing and fantasy play. That's part of the ability to be able to visualize. And in lieu of that, when everything is external and you shut off that internal dialogue, you receive it from elsewhere. And so that then becomes the authoritative narrative. And that is, when they say speak your truth, it's being given to you from elsewhere. And so it literally becomes programming. And it's a terrifying concept. Again, from my perspective, the more I know, the more terrifying it is that they had many of these principles worked out before the 1920s.
That's the thing, is it's intentional and nefarious. It's not an accident. It wasn't like, oh, whoops, this device just so happens to completely fuck you up for the rest of your life.
That's
like, that thing, was designed.
That is both the most terrifying and sickening thing about it, is that it wasn't accidental. It wasn't a whoopsie. It was intentionally done for untoward reasons, for the specific purpose of, and again, with everything else, the same reason they fluoridated the water, the same reason GMOs. It's not just for, it's not just to make a whole bunch of big agro industry so we can feed a lot of people. It's so that we can give you food without nutrition and poison you at the same time, and make it where you can't become aware, and we're going to calcify your pineal gland. So it is in some ways, to me, the idea that any of us have survived and come to a
Yeah,
place of realization that, hey, man,
it's a
they're trying
beautiful
to kill
thing.
us is pretty remarkable.
It
Um,
really
I,
is.
I do see a number of things, especially every day that I see more and more examples of the worst possible crap in media. Like, it's so unbelievable. It seems intentionally um, crappy. Like, it's so not believable that it's like they're either poking and taunting us, which I think is part of it, or again, it's this a litmus test to see who's going to wake and who's not, and those who accept it just have to accept it. It doesn't matter if they used cardboard cutouts in a puppet show to show a spacewalk. They're, yeah, that's totally real. It's um,
100%.
yeah, because they have to believe it. They must, and they're so deeply mesmerized and hypnotized by this that they simply each little bit of it just reinforces it, and it becomes a reification of it. And so, but I think that in part, this them putting out a bunch of crap did wake a few people up and go,
Yeah.
okay,
It was
really?
like a little too much too early or
A little
something.
too much. And, and then I see
Good.
some things look
Their
like,
hubris will be their end.
yeah, I think, for example, one of the ones I think in that is the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing.
Yeah.
From my perspective, again, I could be totally wrong about this. This is simply conjecture, but from what I see, the entire thing is staged start to finish. Like, the character is a character. It doesn't even really exist.
Yeah.
The whole thing is made up to divide people between the ones sort of, I would say, sort of more in our group, who go, see, we told you that high powered pedophiles are there,
Hmm.
and then divide it with the other people, go, nothing, you guys are a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists, blah blah blah. So it's a little bit of confirmation to the one group, but with nothing firm to grab onto because they took it away. So you can't really say, see, it's absolutely true. Then, of course, he supposedly kills himself, and there's all these photographs that were again go against every. I mean, it was clearly the narrative doesn't work. That
Yeah.
whatever they're telling us is not true. But from my perspective, the information I have right now leads me to believe that the whole thing is for show. It's for effect. It's what in the military you would call fire for effect. You're not trying to hit the target. You're trying to shake the people up, right? So you're trying to get an emotional response. So there's a group of people who have this emotional response. Same thing, I think, with I would say at this point, similar thing with Comet Pizza and Pizzagate.
Hmm.
That was an intentional leak for some people to go, yeah, see, we told you, and then for the other group to go, oh, see, it's a hoax, it's nonsense, blah blah. So it plays the role of, for example, Alex Jones. It's the crazy conspiracy theorist who's in part telling truth, but then you can dismiss everything that he says because he's clearly crazy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it performs these purposes, but
This is what Freeman Fly calls weaponized conspiracy theories.
there you go. And I think that it ultimately the primary goal that it serves is for those who are running the program to be able to see who is divergent, if you want to use the name of that movie, Truth in the Movies,
Yeah.
Lies in the News, to see who is going to be the troublemaker. And from my experience, I won't even say, I won't get too much further into how the experiences themselves, but here's what my experience tells me is when they switch the flip, right, and there is some big event after which they martial law or whatever you want to call it,
So
and
when Trump gets reelected and everyone
right,
fucking
or
starts murdering
that,
each other.
yeah, that's one, but to me that seems a little straightforward. I think the most likely scenario to me is a combination of one of the above,
Yeah.
any of the above, or some combination, is that there's potentially this 11-3 thing, Seattle, that's
Right.
been floating around. There seems to be enough stuff there that while I normally dismiss those, I go, there's
There's
some
a bit there, yeah.
there's a bit there. It follows similar patterns, and the way that it came out again makes me suspicious that it is an intentional leak, and that again, it could be either for them to go, see, we told you it wasn't true, right, so you guys are crazy, or to do the same thing as the sort of the Epstein thing. So who knows, but
Yeah.
but there's some evidence that it's bit different than your average bear, I guess. Anyway, so it's either like that. There's some precipitous event that is either like a false flag terror event that could be from that one. The basic story is that some firebomb or whatever, and it could be blamed on Russia or what have you. That's what the predictive programming would suggest from the movies and television shows, is that it would be a foreign actor, probably Russia, is the most frequently shown perpetrator of that, but it happens during the football game. And includes fire and the Space Needle coming down. So some event like that in which there's an external threat. There's always the external threat of alien that could be done at any time. So that would be another big one. To me, the most likely event currently, because I just don't see them waste a lot of, like, to me, nothing is wasted energy. So even things that seem like nonsense or that didn't come to fruition. So when I watched closely the whole Jade Helm event, I had a sense that nothing was going to happen then, so that they could, again, mock anybody who said that there would. But the training had a purpose, right? It was large scale training for essentially establishing martial law. Right. But one of the biggest ones that they do most frequently, that receives very little press about, is what they would call a dark skies or dark horizons event, which is a major power grid failure. And that
is practicing that one recently.
Yes, and that one is has got a lot of because they keep saying that's our again, with the predictive programming and for opening the Overton window, they keep saying that's our most vulnerable part, and then a lot of people could be hacked, or they could blame it on a solar corona event, or a wide variety of things.
Yeah, it could be foreign, domestic, or natural, or
supernatural, or who knows, right? Yeah. So they could blame it on a variety of different things, but the net result is that it would, if they brought down, let's say, the entire, United States. Let's not even go worldwide. Let's just go with the United States, or even regional. Let's say the West Coast or the East Coast. I think would be even worse. Yeah. Because of the concentration of population there is so densely,
and the lack of natural food and
resources.
Water sources.
Yes, exactly. But it does seem that Northern California has been a big test bed with these directed energy weapon events and wildfires. Seems to be a test run for this thing, and so again, I don't think they waste any energy, but they've been using these big things, and I see it also played out within some of the other Five Eyes country. They did it in New Zealand, they've done it in Australia a few times, and again, it doesn't make the press real big over here, but it does show up that they're testing these things out, and you can really quickly see what happens is that after about the third day, the panic really sets in, and a lot of people can't go 6 hours without Twitter. They freak out just when they get DDoS on a website. So without actual power, it's really bad. And if you went a week in an urban area, that means that no resources, means no water pumps. It means food, everything that you had frozen or refrigerated is now gone bad. You can't get anything else. And if the trucks can't get in with more food, now we're talking the worst parts of a zombie movie, but without, zombies are just people.
Dude, I was at Costco today and fucking people were treating each other like animals over a goddamn little fucking sample. Like, that's in a Costco when the power's on and they're well fed and hydrated.
Yep.
Like, I can't imagine. And I've always been a person that's like disappointed in how the media seems to portray humans as not being capable of coming together and supporting each other in a disaster. But then days like today, I'm like, dude, maybe we can't. Maybe this is how people are. Like, maybe it's all exactly like they say. And I hope that's not true. But
it really is tough. I'm constantly the lower I set the bar of my expectations, they never disappoint me, and that is the saddest thing, right? So anyway, I go back to that and go, let's say they shut down the power for 2 weeks across the country, right? At this point, everyone, and I don't care how big you are on what kind of boogaloo kit you got or how much weapons you got, when you're starving and got no water, and everybody around you is going crazy, you're going to be happy to see the FEMA trucks roll up, and everybody will immediately begin sucking a titty. And they're dependent. Right. They're dependent on the government, and it doesn't matter what kind of patriot they think they are at that point. They're going to be happy to see military roll up with some provisions. And then it's really easy to go just a little further to say, okay, this event caused this collapse of this infrastructure such that we can get power and resources back in the major cities, and we've got spaces for you here, or these camps that we have set up. So your choices are to go in these smart grid cities, or and if you look at Agenda 2020, they want to rewild.
Yeah,
That's
I was
the
gonna
thing.
say,
They already
that's
want to rewild
exactly.
all the other stuff, and so they go. Not only can we not protect you or give you services out there, but it's also illegal by penalty of death to be out there because we're trying to save the world, and now you're trying to prevent it. So
And it's
we can't.
already illegal to collect water and
Right.
hunt and like all
Sure.
these
Grow
things you
food
would
or
need to
anything.
do to survive. Yeah.
Right. So you're human scum, and you're poisoning the world, and so you can't be out there to poison it. And it would only take 2 generations from putting people into a Judge Dredd type city, or again like the movie Divergent, where they put up a wall and then they tell you, and sort of like M. Night Shyamalama Ding Dong, The Village, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
they tell them that there's something scary out there, so don't go out there. So they don't have to. Again, if you put a keep out sign, people are going to get curious and they want to go. But if you tell them there's something scary and worrisome, oh, there's gangs, there's bands of reavers or whatever out there, and
Yeah.
they'll get you, right? The ones who didn't come in, they'll eat you. They're cannibals and blah. And so they just start telling those stories, and so everybody's afraid to go outside the city. And so then you have these just like Judge Dredd, just like name a dystopian movie where everybody's cramped into these cities that's completely, surveillance and 1984 on steroids. That could happen within months if they turn off.
And then it's a complete reset. You're disconnected from everything that came before then.
That's right. And then if there's some other events to go along with it, I mean, it could happen within, I think, within a year. And certainly if you knock off again, the really scary part is if you go and look at some of the risk management websites that aggregated risk that insurance people look at, and you start looking at some of the stuff that has to do with population. Between 2020 and 2025, they've got population in the U.S. reduced by like 80%.
I remember, what was Stratfor? Stratfor had a couple books that they published, and they had the same sort of thing going on.
Yeah, so I started finding it in other places, and again, I was looking at risk amortization for insurance stuff, and those same numbers appeared. So in a number of different corollary sources, the number that they, in the United States anyway, they dramatically reduced the estimated population, and I just don't think that's a mistake, right? That seems.
How do those people working with those numbers not have some sort of conscience to say, wait, what's this? Or like, hey, normal people who don't look at these numbers all the time, why do you think these random fucking forces that created these numbers did that?
I don't know.
I
really can't answer that question, because, I mean, if I had no knowledge of any of the things that I do, and I looked at that, I went, well, that's odd. And I'm sure that people, I watch it happen a lot when people are faced with cognitive dissonance. They get information that, directly contradicts what they think. There's always the instant thing where they try to justify it. Just like if somebody saw a ghost, they try to immediately say, oh, well, it was this or that, or I imagined it, or they try to come up with what they consider a rational explanation.
Right.
And so it's just the way the brain works. It doesn't fit into their belief system, and they can't accept it. I think there's probably some of that goes on, like, oh, they just the numbers didn't come in right, or they broke it down differently, or there may be some of that. Lindsay, I can't tell you, because again, even if I didn't know the things that I know, I would look at that and go, well, that's terribly bizarre.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I would just think like, well, somebody made a mistake or something. Maybe they're missing a zero, but it's it's like an 80% reduction. It's remarkable. And then again, you look at the things they actually say, and rewilding, and that they want to do population reduction, and the thing they don't explicitly say, hey, we want a bunch of you to die, but on the other hand,
they imply it over and over again in so many ways, and by they I mean all kinds of, like the UN does. Bill Gates openly says it.
Says it.
The royal family talks about it.
Yeah, it's it's pretty remarkable. And I think what's more remarkable is that more people don't catch it. And when they do, they immediately, again, try to rationalize it. And the Stockholm syndrome kicks in and they try to defend it. And so the fact that those things happen, again, to me, show malice of forethought to a degree that is just, I don't have words for it really, of what the taste it puts in my mouth of how
like psychopathy is too light of a word.
Is way too light, because that implies that it's a mistake of
genetics or something.
Yeah, they've gone a little cuckoo and they're just not even responsible for it. And this is not that. This is malice of forethought, to a degree that is so sickening. And again, I mean, to a degree, I can kind of understand it, because I think those people are themselves misled, and that some of them even believe they're doing the right thing. In
some
this,
of them,
I think some of them
can't.
No, some of them can't, but I think some of them would buy into the idea that well, you've seen Prince Philip say that if he were to reincarnate, he'd come back as a deadly virus, so he could wipe out 80% of the world's population.
What a piece of trash!
That's a piece of shit for sure. But there are some people who pick up on that, and they connect with and resonate with the idea that humans are, Greta says this, and you see Extinction Rebellion do this. They say that we're a disease on the planet. It's the line straight from the Matrix. You are the virus. There's too many of us. The idea, to me, it's bullshit. The numbers don't add up. That overpopulation, and there's too many of us, and we're this deadly virus on the planet, and we're going to kill it. And so, in order for everything to survive, most people have to die, and that's becoming a more and more common idea that people accept and support. Is that and the worst part, again, here's the irony they don't catch, is that they're blaming the rank and file people for the things that everything is explicitly done by those who are in charge. Like, even if it was fossil fuels, which is, again, it's a misnomer, it's not fossil fuel, it's abiotic. So, and that's been proven. So even that's a lie. But let's say the use of carbon emissions or whatever, let's say that was the problem. And all the climate shit was right. Even if that were the case, the people causing it were the ones who sold the oil and managed it for the longest period of time. They only gave us one option. It's not as if we had any other option. So it's not. I think
some people tried some other options and were killed off.
Yeah,
too,
and they get right, and then they shut it down. So they basically, this is like a parent who feeds kids candy and sweets and then blames them for being fat.
Yes.
And then when they cry about it, they go, oh, it's all your fault, blah, blah. Now have a cookie, you'll feel better. And
this is the same trick of legalese that we were talking about earlier, where they trick you into agreeing with it. So they've tricked people into hating themselves and wanting to kill themselves. The
same idea as getting people to accept the idea of white privilege and white guilt. That we're all being oppressed to a certain degree, and we're going to oppress one group of you a little less, and then blame you for it and say that you're bad and you're a racist because you're being somewhat slightly oppressed less than somebody else, and it's your fault. But who's the guy wearing the boot? Right? I mean, that's who we're supposed to be fighting against. And this is the whole gotcha thing. Yeah, exactly. And this is the whole gotcha thing. And I see these things. We commented about it last time, and I see it bouncing around, and I still want to look further into it to get a better handle on this idea of. I was fascinated with your talk about EMDR, and I know another person who did that for PTSD, and the idea of what would it take to get like a widespread mass EMDR thing. And, and I mean, if you think of the idea of They Live, right? The glasses, or turning off the sub frequency that they were embedding into the carrier wave, right? If you could turn that off, people would wake up. I wonder, are they saying that there is something, that there is a way that you could wake people up? I'm not very sanguine about that. But if there were a way to quickly, God, if I knew a way to get those magic glasses from They Live, and just to give them a moment so they could see how the world that they live in for just a moment.
Perspective, yeah. That's always been my superpower that I want when people ask that question, like, what's your superpower? Like, I want to be able to walk up to people and tap them on the forehead and just give them just that perspective.
Well, see, then I'm the kind of rationalist that would find that really scary. You go, the ability not only to have total understanding, but to give somebody else total understanding with a tap, it would kill them. I think most
True.
people completely explode, and they would just go,
Yeah.
yeah, no,
There's a reason that doesn't exist.
right. So
Plus,
perhaps,
I
and
would
I
be
think in
like
the same way,
indiscriminate and just be like tapping everyone and cause chaos.
yeah, and I think in the same way that we, if we get back to the idea of language and expression of language that we began with, is that we say that English is a poor language for description of emotion and interrelationships. It's a good for describing physical objects, but it's poor for describing intangible things. And so the question always goes, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just think thoughts to each other? And certainly there's an appeal to that. And then there's this other thing where you go, would that really be a great idea? Like and I think it's the nature of, again, mankind, that we do rely on lies a little bit, because again, I'll go back to this idea that we're all fragmented and broken, and we know it, and we don't want other people to know it, and we can't accept ourselves. And so we're so terrified of being transparent with other people because we can't accept ourselves. We know that we're broken, and we don't want anybody else to know how screwed up we are. And so this idea that what if you did have complete telepathy and could read each other's thoughts? I think everybody, when they really tear that down, thinks it would cause utter chaos and it would stop society in its tracks. And I think the way things are now, to a degree, that's absolutely true. But that speaks directly to the broken nature of mankind, and where we are now is that people sort of can't live without the illusory experience of what social media and Instagram and that sort of thing is, by putting out this false persona that doesn't exist, so that they can survive and get that acceptance that they so desperately need, because people are not even comfortable with themselves. Imagine what would happen if they knew what somebody else really thought of them, and that they didn't get that acceptance. And but to me, the idea, hey, if we were the kind of people where we could freely accept and freely offer genuine thoughts about one another and about what things are, that would be the most powerful, loving embrace ever. And yet, again, just like I described, the trying to hug a beaten down, abused dog, you're going to get bit.
Yeah.
Right. So in spite of the best intentions, the circumstances are unfortunately so bad right now that, I have, again, I want to leave people depressed and hopeless, but I would say that from my perspective, again, I'll say this again, over and over, as long as the circumstances are the way they are now, is that if you want to change the world, the best thing to do is to first, change yourself and just change the world around you. Right.
That's
so
absolutely right.
Your immediate space around you, that's the only thing you can really influence. And if your idea of, again, you're going to change the world by going out and going to a protest and kicking the shit out of somebody who disagrees with you, that's not really changing the world for the better, I don't think. And demonstrably not so. You're causing physical and emotional harm to somebody else. So that's not really making the world a better place. So if you really want to make the world a better place, make those around you feel accepted and loved, including yourself. And that is
especially yourself.
Especially yourself, right? And that doesn't mean being sort of a self-codependent relationship, right? And you're sort of enabling yourself.
To be like honest and
right.
Critical.
So not enabling yourself and excusing.
It's a fine line between like self-abuse and self-criticism, but
right.
You do want to criticize yourself.
You want to be honest. You want to be honest and accept those things. To me, it was
always room to improve.
Yeah, one thing that when I was seeing a counselor at one point, and I had some issues that I kept bouncing up against, right? And I couldn't seem to get past them. And she recommended that I read a book, Adult Children of Alcoholic Parents. And I'm like, well, that's retarded because my parents were teetotalers. It just doesn't make any sense. And she goes, sickness is sickness. It doesn't matter what it looks like, right? It doesn't matter what the drug of choice is. And in this case, it was religion instead of alcohol.
Yeah.
But the behaviors are similar. And she's like, just read the book. It's like $5. Just read the book. If it doesn't resonate with you, throw it away. I don't care. Right. If it does, eat the meat, throw away the bones. That's what you say. And I'm like, that is what I say. So I read it, and I had, again, this mixed emotions. My first thing was sort of like a sort of sickness that hit, like, oh my God, this is real. Like, this explains the stuff. And then I was like, wait, so okay, I'm not crazy. I mean, I guess I am a little bit, but this is not, it's not because I'm such a fuck up. It's because these things were given to me. And then it's sort of like, a lot of people will stop there and go, oh, okay, well, it's my parents' fault, blah, 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 right? It's like, so I immediately came to this place of going, okay, so while it wasn't my fault, so it took a lot of relief of burden of guilt off me in
Yeah.
saying it's not my fault that these things happened, but it is now my responsibility. Now that I know what it
Boom.
is, it's my responsibility. I'm the only one who can change those things, and they're
Literally the only one.
only one, right, who can change those things. So that was a profoundly powerful experience for me, which
Super.
again started out being like, doesn't make any sense. My parents didn't drink. Like, it's not
Yeah.
even, but the behaviors were uncannily similar. And so it was extremely helpful to me to. So I think in a similar way, if you when you come to a place of accepting your own faults in a way that's honest and say, I have these issues, and then but you can still love yourself, and then
Yeah.
make an attempt to work through it or find a better coping mechanism.
Mhm.
And then to me, the externalized version of that is to extend grace to other people, to say, I understand, hurt people. Some of the people I try to be nicest to are the most unpleasant people, because I can easily see how they got to where they were. It's not really, again, their fault. Say
Yeah.
that they continue in those behaviors, so they're still perpetuating it. But I can see how they got there, and in many cases, not always, and not even very much sometimes, but to a certain degree, showing kindness and love to those people can have a profound impact on them, and especially
True.
if you have any influence on them over time, when you're consistent about it, that they can respond in a positive way to kindness. And again, in the same way as an abused animal would, when they learn to trust over time, that you're going to be consistent and caring. I think those things are key. And so if you want to change the world, that's my encouragement to people. If you want to change the world, try to just change the world around you. You're not likely to have a lot of success on the large scale, the macro, but on the micro scale, if you can love yourself and love those around you, that's one of the most difficult challenges I know of. It's a
Absolutely.
lot better than paying a carbon tax, right? And probably a lot
And
more
ceding
effective.
even more of your control to something external.
Agreed.
Um,
So that's I guess that's the thing that I would like to leave people with is that, again, I always want to be positive and go, not just be kind, but be kind to yourself, and think things through. And if you find yourself having a powerful emotional response that's inconsistent with the nature of the stimulus, if you're in a reactionary mode and you just react right away, even though it's sort of natural, like we both had this reaction to the idea of silver iodide being put in babies' eyes. It's so gut wrenching, right? It just well, anger wells up in you because you want to, fix that. Like anger being a powerful motivation to correct injustice. That is
yeah.
the most unjust thing, that you're damaging the most helpless people. But so that's reasonable. But when you get mad because somebody asks you a question about, well, what if you were to just not, what would happen if you just didn't cut that umbilical cord? And there's this vicious, vitriolic rage. Man, if that comes up in you over something you read in the news, or somebody poking you on Facebook, or you read something you don't like, that's something that's an opportunity for growth, I think, right?
Yeah.
Rather than attack the other person, take a look inside and see what caused that, and what identify what other times that you felt that way, and see if you can track it back to its source, and do some self care there. I know that sounds all weird and new agey, but
But
um,
that's a self-reflective, that's a meditative practice that's in many traditions around the world and is ancient, is to notice and observe your emotional response to a stimuli and to try to trace it back to its origin and figure out what it is. What is that?
it, it
So it's
seems
like you're describing this like it's like a psychological thing, but it's also this spiritual practice.
Yeah, it seems intuitive when you think about it, but
Yeah.
it's the last thing that people do, really, because again, I think we all get into a thing, and this is again where we start, is that we want to defend our
Yeah.
current position as being correct and accurate and right, and that
We don't want to
um,
change.
we don't want to change, and we don't want to be wrong. and we don't want to be proven wrong. So we're going to defend for all we have our position, even if that means all kinds of logical fallacies, appeal to authority, reification fallacies, all kinds of things.
Straight up bullying.
Yeah, exactly. And calling other people names and shutting down the conversation so that we don't have to have it to ensure that we can continue on with our current worldview.
I just want to say that one of the people in that conversation that reacted that way came to me, I think about 24 hours later, called me and said, I really don't even understand why I became so emotional. And I am very sorry that I did so. And I'm going to try to figure it out. And I was like so impressed because it's very, very, very uncommon that anybody self-reflects or examines. It's becoming less common that people will apologize for anything. And so to have done all of that in such a short time, I was very, in the least condescending way possible, I was very proud to see that. And I think that because not only is that it's just a good practice, but it's also like when you do that to someone else, when you say like, oh, I realized that I did this thing and I want to do better next time, and I'm sorry, then it also encourages that person to have the same sort of reflection. And it's a what we're saying, like loving yourself and then trying to love other people, like this ripples out. It has an effect on the whole world around you. And maybe it's only immediate, but it
sure.
keeps going.
And I think it's true in any relationship. It's important that even if you don't think you were wrong, it's often important to say you're sorry. Because if I have a disagreement with somebody, I may not have been incorrect on the nature of the data, but if I behaved in a way that I'm not proud of, if I became a little too aggressive or whatever, I can certainly apologize. Even if I don't feel like I did anything wrong, if I know that their feelings are hurt, I'm genuinely sorry that I did anything or behaved in a way that hurt your feelings. And I can be sorry about that for sure. That may seem a little bit insincere to some people, but I don't think so. I think it validates the fact that the person's feelings were hurt. Now, I don't want to say it in a way like, I'm sorry your feelings were hurt. That's a little condescending, right? But I can acknowledge that their feelings may have been hurt or it made them feel a certain way, even if I did something that, again, was a trigger within them that I had no idea they had a landmine there and it blew up. I still feel badly that happened. I can express concern for them as a person and care about them in a way that doesn't invalidate or belittle or minimize their emotions. And this is where, again, I think we have this big conflation between emotional validation and factual validation. Is that it's now being pushed that your emotions are right rather than facts.
Your emotions and your opinions are more important than facts or logic or reasoning.
Exactly. And we've got those things turned upside down, right? So the facts are generally what they are. They're stubborn things. Emotions are not unreal. They're certainly valid to the person, but they don't really have a major impact on the actual situation other than how they're going to react and what they're going to bring to it. So that's up to that person to manage how they behave based on their emotions. But it certainly it's not going to help the situation to inflame or dismiss their emotions either. Right. So to either jack them up on purpose for a laugh or to dismiss them as being invalid, you're being irrational and emotional, that's not going to help. Right. So the old joke is that, the best way to when a woman comes at you and she's upset is to say, hey, you're overreacting. Yeah, that's.
Oh my God. When people are like, why are you so upset? I'm like, I'm not upset. And they're like, why are you so angry? I'm like, I'm not angry. And they're like, yeah, but you're getting really upset. I'm like, dude, now I'm angry. Like what?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's not effective, or it's very effective depending on what your goal is.
It's very effective depending on which side of that you're on. So
yeah.
So I think I think that certainly. It's fascinating to explore, somebody, like you who has a, I perceive that you're somebody who has a keen sense of being able to connect and identify other people's emotions as well as your own. And not everybody is that self-aware. So I find it fascinating to have conversations with you, Lindsay, on that, in that regard. I think we could, explore those things at another time, especially about the nature of relationships and especially male-female relationships, which is, I think, one of the in terms of divide and conquer and the Hegelian dialectic, that is
Yeah.
one of the oldest and most malformed things societally over time that I can see, is that we've been made the enemies of each other, because together we become unstoppable forces when we become a balanced team of the male and the
Truly.
feminine. And both have been, to me, destroyed. They've destroyed what it means to be feminine, and misdescribed it. They've destroyed what it means to be masculine, and certainly the balance between them has long been a disequilibrium that's dangerous. And so there's always a pendulum swing back and forth between who's in control. And I don't think it was ever supposed to be a matter of control. It's supposed to be a matter of teamwork. And so to me, that's one of the most egregious things in all of the history of mankind, is that they've taken that most sacred relationship of love between a man and a woman, and what we could be together, and turned it into a war, and labeled it as such, the war between the sexes, for as far back as I can read, going, I mean, literally 3,500 BC or more, about the arguments and the differences between men and women, as fascinating and clearly to me intersecting in a tangential way that is strength to strength, and strength balances weakness, and it's perfect, and turns it into a battle. And to me, I mean, that's one of the most egregious things, is that's the oldest artificial conflict that I see.
Literally the oldest and the most fundamental, and the one that if we could solve, I think would undo all of their machinations. That is actually what my novel Sine Curve of Aeons is fundamentally about.
I need to read that.
It's fun. It starts out especially very young adult fiction, but by the end it's a little bit more mature, and then the sequel is the same. It's a little bit, the vibe of it is young adult fiction, so it's not very like lofty, or I don't know, however you want to describe that. It's definitely not super adult fiction.
Yeah, it's awesome though, because at your introduction, I almost interjected before you even got done and go, "Wow, you're great with the words. You should write a book." And then you wrapped up your introduction with saying, "And if you want to read my novel and my blog," I'm like, "Well, there you go. I don't even have to say anything. You're all over."
Yeah,
it, so.
And the sequel is almost done, and the sequel is so fun. I'm so excited.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna have
We'll
to
talk
get a
about
copy
that in the future.
I'm gonna have to get a copy of that. I'd love to. I'll pick your brains offline. That'll be fascinating.
I would love that. That'd be fun. So yeah, I would definitely like to have you back again to discuss that
Sure.
exact thing, because that's a fascinating deception there. And I just want to give you a moment if you have any final last words that you want to say before we wrap things up.
No, I think again, first, thanks for having me. So it's been a pleasure the last couple of times we've talked, and it seems the rabbit holes are endless. And again, I love exploring different ideas with people who are bright and energetic and open-minded. And I think we the things that I've seen you talk with other people, but as well the other shows that I've seen you do, I really encourage again what you're doing, and I love that you're reaching out to people. So yeah, if I had anything to wrap up with, again, it would be, my encouragement is to care for yourself. Right, you have nothing to give if you're damaged beyond the ability to care for yourself. You don't have any hope of caring for others. And then again, if you want to change the world, try to change the world immediately around you. That's your best hope, and the best chance at instant feedback and to see results. You're going to be really disappointed if you try to work at a macro level and feeling powerless the whole time. I think that's part of, again, the discouragement, is that they want you to feel powerless and incapable and just impotent, and you're not. Right, you have more power than you imagine. And I think ultimately, if I got down to what are they hiding from us, it is who you are and why you're here. And I'm not going to try to fill in the blanks for you. I think part of the amazing part of that is the journey in getting there, in answering those questions for yourself. If you accept anything that somebody else has given you and you're just parroting a line, it's no better than just going to the indoctrination centers and repeating the narrative they gave you. There's no point in it, and you're never going to go from knowledge to understanding, right? You've got to experience it for yourself. And I think if you begin on that journey in earnest, and you really have the intellectual honesty and the temerity and the integrity and the discipline to go through it, which are hard things, but the reward is so great. And I had this conversation with somebody recently that, I basically just at the end of every day, I try to ask myself two questions, right? Is that, did you make improvement today? Did you do better today than before? And then also, did you do your best? And a lot of days I can't answer yes to either or both of those questions. But when you can, there's a real sense of accomplishment there. And mostly I can say yes to the first one, and the second one's harder to say you did your absolute best every single day in all circumstances. Is hard to really do and maintain. But you will find that the more you do, you begin to build this momentum as you move forward. And so it becomes a really enjoyable, fun progress to see that you're growing into a person that you would ultimately like, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a person that you're ashamed of other people getting to know and that you're afraid of. The ultimate thing of love, to my view, is to know and be known. And the fear of being known prevents most people from intimacy. And so we keep people at arm's distance and go through all sorts of gyrations to get the acceptance that we want without really giving them what they want. And it's sort of this scarcity mentality and through everything, both materially and spiritually and emotionally. So if you can feed others emotionally and learn to receive love yourself and make the little changes daily and around you, I think that your life will certainly be much more enjoyable, regardless of what the PIC or they or the controllers or the elites or whatever you want to call them, regardless of whatever they want to do. I think if there's any chance of breaking the matrix, it is that love overpowers evil and hatred and darkness, and that when light penetrates darkness, light has to run. There, even a little match makes light flee, or makes darkness flee. The smallest amount of light. There is no darkness is simply the absence of light, right? It is not a substance in and of itself. And so the only hope that darkness has of crushing the light is just to put it out. So if you can keep yourself a light and alive and spread that around, there is still hope. So that's, I guess, what I would have is there's still hope.
Absolutely well spoken. Fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. This has been your analog, concentric, electric dose of wisdom, according to the Great Baldini. Baldini, thank you so much for being with us here again tonight. I look forward to the next time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The tricks that keep us tempted into tarnishing our sovereignty for a bit of ease are many, but we are unwearied. They are varied, but we are ever inventive. They are multi-layered, but we are tireless in our peeling. They are tenacious, but we are never ending. We remain, we prevail, and we always get back up and remember what is at stake and what we will not stop until we achieve, and that is freedom. Until you break yourself out of the trap and run for the hills, travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside.
101 lesson, so do your homework. Make your dome hurt. While up on earth, my bones are blessed from holy dirt. Vibes manifested to words that told me search for verbs and adjectives to describe birth. Worth more than one can speak. While the tongue feeds a weak, a sour taste in your mouth, bittersweet. Words can also kill you when you sleep. Mind condition, low frequencies while the subconscious mind listens. I can tell a vision filled with lies disguised as truth, and spread it like the word to the youth. Watch the tube. A place where the God gets booed is sorcery. To recreate a God forgery does more than meets the eye. Not too many know. Just hear me flow like the eye of Horus Penio. Yeah, not ready to leave until we believe we're free to go. You hear me? Right.
Sculpted from the ether, the material will eat ya. Stuck on this plane, lanes use jet fuel to greet ya. The dimension of 3 ain't meeting me on top of the 4th. Didn't climb Jacob's ladder to squab with a sword, forged with Yggdrasil, branched out, try quiet your lamps now. Ascension past the matter, let they slam out they damn mouths. We ain't on land now, but they over understand. Sacrificing wisdom, hoarding dumber, kosher, wicked hands. Putting faith in worthless worship of the mortals. Artificial portals, mass ingestion of the black goo. Bioengineered morsels, conversing with machine elves. Bypassing maggots, they stuck on Android screens now. I'm scrolling emerald tablets. Moloch living lavish, off the backs of the savage. Them clasp hands at the Sabbath. Smack of energy damage, they done twisted the tongues. But nanotech in the lungs, the awakening's begun. All they really can do is fucking run.